Oh my goodness. Back on the air. All right. Well, I'm really, it's really interesting. I'm like pushing the envelope with this intermission page. Theoretically, my chat is supposed to display in here, and I guess, the reason why my chat is not displaying in the intermission page is because I've really got to add something into in here to get that to work. But what's going on? Well, this is supposed to be a Macarena stream, and I'm really, like right about now, I should be. If I'm getting up at 4:30 in the morning to stream, I should go to bed right now. But I wanted to see. And I've had this conversation about Gretz, Heinrich Gretz. Um, and the thing about him is that I'm looking. Is Macarena going to run? The anti-cheat software. It looks like it was starting up or something. Okay, yeah, it's starting to run. Okay, but um, people that know me know that as a kid I got into, or my mother kind of managed to get me interested in the Kabbalah, right, and mysticism, and so when I was exposed to Gretz as a historian, the teacher, it may have been Rabbi David B. Ruderman, could have been, or maybe that Rabbi Shai Cherry. One of these courses, uh, history courses that I was taking, talked about Gret's history, and when it was presented, it was like, well, it's a really huge, 6-volume history of the Jewish people, right? But the guy was like, well, it's kind of sanitized. It's like he was kind of presenting Jews as very modern, and he left out all this Kabbalistic stuff that I was into, and that sort of, I was like, well, I'm not going to read that, and I thought, like, I was and I mentioned this before, I was donating a book to my temple library, and it was Alan Deutschman's Change or Die, which is a local Jewish writer from around Atlanta, and I was doing a stream on books, and I had this idea of like, well, I naturally, with my online bookstore, I come in, sometimes I have books, bale upon bale of books where I've managed to get some deal on a lot of secondhand books, or even new books that are just being discarded or whatever like that, and I'll go through them. I thought, well, I can make a show, and one of the, Deutschman's book came up, and I was joking about change or die. It's like, scare you into buying this book. You're gonna die unless you buy it, or something like that. I don't know. I was teasing or whatever. But then I read it cover to cover, and I was like, wow, this is actually a really good book. And one of the things I liked about it is it opens up with like all these people that they have, angioplasty, and the doctor's like, you got to change your diet, you got to start, you got to start exercising, you got to eat less, you got to control your cholesterol, blood pressure, and all stuff, or you're gonna die, right? And he asked the question in the beginning of the book, could you do it? A lot of people would say yes. Well, let's look at the statistics, and most people can't and don't, and eventually they die with heart failure or something like that. But then he proceeds to go and look at all the cases where, somebody came up with a system that worked. And first he found some people that actually were facing heart failure that did change their life, and looked at what they did, right? And then he takes it, he talks about Bill Gates becoming a charitable person, figuring out how to become a donor. He talks, I think, a little bit about it. He ends up talking about bigwigs, but he talks about Delancey Street, which was a recidivist rehabilitation center for drug abuse, criminal, whatever cases, right before they. And it was actually a really good book. So I'm donating it to the Temple Library, and I walk to the shelf, and it's like, not only do they have Josephus, it's like, what is this, the history section? They've got Gretz and Josephus. And I thought to myself, it's like my Jewish relatives that are from Poland, they do not like Josephus, and they would not say this is a Jewish history book. And I think that's a bit unfair. But, Josephus actually was a traitor, and he went into for all we have is what he tells us, and he said, look, I traveled to Rome to plead a case for some people that were called to Rome to answer some charge or whatever. And I haven't read it in a long time, so I forgot exactly what it was. But he's like, when I got there and I saw the extent, the Roman legions and their power and all that stuff like that, I came back and I said, we should not, if we revolt against them, they're too powerful right now, we'll be destroyed, right? It's not in the cards, right? So he presents the situation as like, I said all along, it's not going to work. We don't have a chance, And in fact, they didn't. That the basically the Romans were so powerful at that stage that, yeah, you could resist them, and maybe you wipe out a legion or something like that. And they send another one. They just send another one. It's just like, they can keep doing it because, Jerusalem and Israel is just a very small part of the extent of the Roman Empire at that time. Well, Josephus, he ended up, when the proverbial poop hit the fan, he ended up in a military post at a fortress called Jotapata, and they were eventually, the Romans built a big ramp up to the fortification, and eventually just overwhelmed them. And some people ran, they had secret tunnels or something like that, and they tried to escape. And finally, the Roman soldiers were closing in on these survivors, and Josephus was among them, and they drew lots to commit mass suicide rather than go into captivity and serve the Romans as slaves, right? They all agreed that they would kill themselves, and Josephus, some kind of way, he managed to get the last, and him and one other person, everybody committed suicide. The story goes, and this is what he reported. He said, well, everybody committed suicide, and when there were only a couple of us left, we said, hey man, we could do more if we didn't just kill ourselves here. Let's go. Let's run. And they ran off, right? And they were caught. And Josephus, the way he said, well, I saw in a dream that Vespasian was going to be the next emperor. And apparently, Vespasian is like, yeah, whatever, throw him in jail, throw him in the dungeon or whatever like that. But then some time went by, and it looked like Vespasian was going to be emperor, right? Nero died, suicide or whatever like that. And all of a sudden, Vespasian was like, where was that guy who said he had a dream, that this was going to happen? I'm really interested in him now. And goes and pulls Josephus out of jail, and Josephus ends up writing a big history. He's like, I've got access to books, sources, scrolls or whatever they had back then, right? And if you let me take this material, I'm going to write a definitive history of the Jews, the antiquities of the Jews from ancient history up to the present time, which happened to be 2,000 years ago. About 80-70 is when his work was done. But yeah, it's full of stuff that, where he's like, oh, Titus really, didn't want to burn, official Roman policy is like, don't burn down, the most sacred, or throw down altars or whatever. You want to not, in the Roman Empire, you want to sort of merge everything together, have some cohesion in all the different parts of the empire. So really sacred stuff, the temple and everything, it's not supposed to be, it's like you're specifically told not to do something like destroy the temple, right? And Josephus right, oh yeah, here's a long explanation about Titus didn't intend when they set fire to the temple that it would burn. Right? And a Jewish person reading that, yeah, you get pissed off. You're like, that's so like pandering to the Romans. It is. Right? It is. That's why Jewish people would get offended. Anybody that with any kind of background on Jewish history or whatever, when you read the gospel account of how Pontius Pilate was just a lowly procurator and he really didn't want to hurt anybody and he was trying to let Jesus off, but the Jews wanted to kill him. That's a total falsification. And a Jewish person with some background and historical expertise knows that Pontius Pilate was not a lowly official with a big heart or whatever like that. He was a ruthless governor. He was a Roman equestrian that was rising through the ranks and took governorship over what was to be Palestine and exercised power. He crucified a lot of people at the drop of a hat, especially on Passover. And even in Josephus, when you read what we have in Josephus about Pontius Pilate and Passover, it's like there's a report where they were like, we don't care what the Jews think or whatever. And the Passover festival is coming, and some centurion gets up on this wall and moons all the Jews, right? Drops trowel and dangles his testicles and waves his butt in their faces, right? And a huge riot happens, right? They have to quell, like a uprising or something like that. And that's the kind of information that we have about Pilate. And there's like massive slaughter. And with information like that, you can bet if somebody like Jesus did, in fact, possibly he did ride in on a donkey, Hosanna or whatever. Maybe it did happen. Pilate wouldn't be like hesitating to crucify him. He would instantly crucify him. He'd probably crucify everybody that knew him. And that's the real Pontius Pilate of history, right? That, and this is the thing that it's a tragedy of today, that there's so much misunderstanding between people of different religions. And it's a problem when people make phony baloney stories that you're required to believe, and it's kind of not fair that the church says, well, you have to believe that the Gospels are the absolute truth. It's like telling somebody, putting them in a round room and telling them they have to pee in the corner or they're going to be thrown out, because you can't do it. Every single passion narrative in the gospel is different. It has different details, and sometimes it's on a different day, and they're all it's transparent, made up stuff by people who didn't speak Aramaic, never met anybody who had met Jesus or spoke Aramaic, right? 100 years, like 3 generations after Jesus' crucifixion. Of course it's full of mistakes and anachronisms and, rabbi, like when they translate there's no rabbis. That Rabbinic Judaism did not start at that point. There were Sicarii, there were Zealots, there were Sadducees, there were Pharisees, there was a Sanhedrin, all those things they had, but all the stuff about, oh, rabbi, all the people going around calling Jesus rabbi, they didn't have rabbis. Then that's obviously wrong. And Jews generally, were banned from being involved in zodiac stuff. Poor Jews is very unlikely would use language about the age of Pisces. But in the Gospels we have Jesus saying, he's doing miracles with fish, which is a symbol of the goddess Aphrodite or whatever, like here's my endorsement from the goddess Aphrodite. Well, the problem with that is like Jews were trying to be monotheistic, right? And they really had sort of course, broadly henotheism, which means the belief that our God is more powerful. Not that, some Jews, of course, put forward the idea that that there was no other God, and contemporary Jews, for those of those that are not, so contemporary Jews, of course, are just they're descendants of the Jewish people, and they're not necessarily religious at all, and they may have a great diversity of views. I certainly have diverse views, but they would things like I will be with you always, even until the end of the age. What is that? The age of Pisces? That's the age that Jesus is talking about. And it's very possible that some Jews were into zodiac stuff, but to, really be broadcasting it and not get into big trouble is highly unlikely. A very poor, outcast sort of person with a, bad reputation like Jesus had or whatever could get away with going around and going, I'm coming back and I'll be with you until the end of the age of Pisces. It's a direct acknowledgement of a polytheistic worldview, that there are other gods. Of course, Aphrodite, whose symbol is the fish, so you do all these miracles with fishes, and that shows that the goddess Aphrodite has endorsed you. That's extremely unlikely to be something that Jesus would have said. It's a big stretch of the imagination to think of Jesus broadcasting that he was into the zodiac. It's kind of hard. It's a stretch. It really is. It's not entirely impossible, but we'll never know. But poor Christians, they're required to believe that or be kicked out of the church, condemned, excluded from the sacraments and everything like that. And that's just, it's a vestige of, an authoritarian government of the Roman Empire. Right? The office of the Pope is the last functioning office of government administration of a defunct empire. But anyway, so this is all tied into what I was going to say about Gretz and Josephus. Like, some people might, if they saw both Gretz and Josephus on a shelf, they, it might be like, is this what you think our history is? Where's Maimonides, and where's these some Jews might be offended by a historian that completely sanitizes Judaism and says there's no Kabbalah, that's not part of our history or whatever. But people are all different, they have different stuff going on. All right, so this is a Macarena stream, so I'm gonna get in here and do some Macarena. What do we do when we're playing Macarena? Blowing away mechs, so it really is obscena. Alright, now I gotta switch to live scene. Alright, now I've got to, there we go. Alright, so my idea is we'll get the tune going and see how far we can get on here. I'm gonna try to shut up, quit talking. And maybe something different. Let's see. Yeah, sort of like that a little bit more. Alright.
Service. The Hittite Uriah, one of David's 30 heroes, who was destined to play a melancholy part in David's career, was deeply attached to the Israelitish nation. The joy over these great achievements remained, however, but for a short time unmarred. The happiness of a state, like that of individuals, is but seldom of long duration, and days of sunshine must be followed by periods of darkness, to prevent the enervation of the national vigor. By one false step, David lost not only his own inward contentment and peace, but shook the very foundations of that state which it had cost him such exertions to establish. When David returned home from the Aramean war, and was resting from the fatigues of battle, which Joab and his army were still undergoing in the land of Ammon, he beheld from the roof of his palace a beautiful woman, who was bathing. She was the wife of one of his most faithful warriors, the Hittite, Uriah, and her name was Bathsheba. The houses of the warriors were built on Zion in the vicinity of the king's palace, and thus he happened to 132 see Bathsheba. Carried away by his passion, he sent messengers to command her to repair to the palace, and Bathsheba obeyed. When David, some time after, found that this violation of the marriage tie had not been without consequences, his only thought was to save his honor, and thus he involved himself in deeper sin. He commanded Uriah to return to Jerusalem from the camp at Rabbah. He received him in a friendly manner, and gave him permission to rest, and enjoy the company of his wife. Uriah, however, made no use of this permission, but remained with the guard, who slept at the entrance of the king's palace, and protected his person. David was disappointed. He sought an escape from the dilemma, and this led him into a heinous crime. As he could not save his honor, he determined that Uriah should lose his life. David therefore sent him to the camp with a letter to Joab, saying that the bearer should be placed in a post of extreme danger of certain death during one of the sorties of the Ammonites. This command was fulfilled, and Uriah fell, struck dead by an Ammonite arrow. Bathsheba fulfilled the customary time of mourning for her husband, and was then received into the palace by David as his wife. In every other state the court circle would have discussed a king's fancy with bated breath. It would hardly have been blamed, and certainly it would soon have been forgotten. But in Israel there was an eye which could pierce this factitious darkness, and a conscience which declaimed in a loud voice against the crimes of even a royal wrongdoer. Prophetism possessed this fair sight which never failed, and this conscience which never slept. It was its foremost duty not to allow sin to grow into a habit by hushing it up and screening it, but to expose it in grand colors, and brand it with the stab of public condemnation. David no doubt believed that Bathsheba alone was cognizant of his sin, and Joab the only accessory to 133 the plot against Uriah's life. But this error was suddenly and rudely dispelled. The prophet Nathan one day came to David, and requested permission to bring a certain case to his notice. He then related the following parable. In a great city there lived a rich man, who possessed great flocks and herds. And near him lived a poor man who possessed but one little lamb, which he had reared for himself. One day, when a guest came to the rich man, he was too stingy to kill one of his flock for the meal, but he took the lamb of the poor man to feast his friend. On hearing this complaint, David's sense of justice was aroused, and he said indignantly that the heartless rich man deserved to die, and should pay the poor man 4 times the value of the lamb. Then the prophet replied, "Thou art the man." Any other king would have punished the moralist who had dared to speak the truth to a crowned head, to the representative of God on earth. David, however, the pupil of the prophet Samuel, when the picture of his misdeeds was thus placed before him, penitently answered, "Yes, I have sinned." He certainly did not fail to offer up heartfelt prayers, and to make atonement in order to obtain God's forgiveness. The child which was born died in early infancy, although David had worn himself away in fasting and prayers for his life. Bathsheba afterwards had a second son named Jedediah, or Solomon 1033, who became the favorite of his father. But though God pardoned the king for his heinous sins, humanity did not forgive them, and they proved fatal to the rest of peace. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, was the daughter of Eliam, one of David's warriors, and the granddaughter of his counselor Ahithophel. The father and grandfather felt their honor disgraced through their daughter's seduction, which they could never forgive, although they kept silence, and did not betray their hatred. Ahithophel especially 134 nursed his vengeance in secret, and only awaited an opportunity to wreak it upon the king. David did all in his power to appease them. He elevated Bathsheba to the rank
This
of
is the
first
worst
queen,
match I've
secretly
played
that her
in.
son should be his successor, and solemnly swore
Memory.
to fulfill his promise. He wished at any cost to make peace with Ahithophel, whose counsel was precious to him. Ahithophel, however, remained immovable. A scandalous event in the house of David involved matters to a still greater extent, and all his remaining years of all tranquility. His eldest son Amnon seduced his half-sister Tamar, and thereby aroused the fierce anger of her brother Absalom, who determined to avenge her. Each of the king's sons, 6 of whom had been born in Hebron, and 11 in Jerusalem, had, when he attained manhood, his own house, household, and lands. Absalom's lands and herds were situated at Baal-Hazor, not far from the capital. Hither he invited all the king's sons to the feast of sheep shearing. Whilst they and their guests were enjoying the feast, and drinking freely, Absalom's servants, at their master's command, attacked Amnon, and dealt him his death blow. Absalom served a double purpose by this murder. He avenged the insult offered to his sister, and hoped to secure his own succession to the throne by ridding himself of his elder brother. The son of Abigail, the second in succession, was already dead, and so it seemed inevitable that he, as the third son, must be the successor. David's son of fratricide. What will be the consequences of this bloody deed? Only his faith in God saved him from becoming, like his predecessor, a victim to insanity, although the dire fate which had befallen him was but too real, and not merely the effect of a distrustful imagination. David's first impulse was to seek out the murderer, who had taken refuge with his grandfather, King Talmai, of Geshur, on the southwest boundary of Judah, 135 inches, order to deal with him as he deserved, even at the risk of going to war on his account. But there were various influences at work against such a policy. In fact, since the affair with Bathsheba, intrigues had been rife at David's court. Joab was opposed to the succession of the last born, Solomon, and was naturally on the side of Absalom, the eldest surviving son. Ahithophel, David's infallible counselor, also favored Absalom's claim to the throne, because he could use him as a tool against his father. On the other hand, Adonijah, David's fourth son, advocated the infliction of condign punishment on Absalom. Adonijah thought his prospects of dissuading the infant Solomon carried on his chance with the remorseless Absalom. If the latter were punished for fratricide, Adonijah would be the next in succession. He and his mother Hameth may perhaps, therefore, have incensed David against Absalom, but Joab and Ahithophel were wiser, and knew how to exert their influence in favor of abandoning all warlike attempts upon him or his grandfather, whose protection he was enjoying. When David had at length decided on seizing or demanding the surrender of his guilty son though he had been absent for 3 years, Joab employed a ruse to turn the king from his resolve. He sent for a woman living in the adjacent town of Tekoa, who had a reputation for adroit and clever speech. With her he devised a plan to make the king realize how horrible it was for a father to be willing to put to death his son for the not altogether unjustifiable murder of his brother. The wise woman of Tekoa consequently appeared before the king in mourning garments, and as though invoking his mercy she called out in an entreating voice and with deep prostrations, "Help! O king, help!" When she stated her fictitious case, the king readily recognized the hidden point of her story, and the allusion to his own case, and he 136 demanded an open answer from her as to whether Job had assisted her in her disguise and invention. When the woman of Tekoa had confessed the truth, the king sent for Job, and assured him that he no longer entertained evil intentions against Absalom, and assigned to him the task of conducting his son to Jerusalem. The woman of Tekoa had, in her ingenious manner, made it clear to him that blood revenge against his own son would be a contradiction in itself. Job himself brought Absalom from Geshur to Jerusalem. The son, however, was not permitted to appear before his father, but was obliged to remain in his own house. By this means Job unconsciously sowed the seeds of dissension in the house of David. Night and day, Absalom, in his isolation and disgrace, brooded over the vile plan of deposing his father. But he dissembled in order to lull the latter's suspicion. To this end it was absolutely necessary that a reconciliation should be effected. Job, who earnestly desired peace between father and son, became mediator, and David decided that, after a 2 years' exile from his presence, his son might now be allowed to return. At this meeting, Absalom played to perfection the part of the penitent, obedient son. David then gave him a fatherly embrace, and the reconciliation was complete. 7 years had passed since the death of Amnon. But now Absalom's intrigues commenced. No doubt he had frequent meetings with Ahithophel, and was following his advice. He obtained chariots and horses from Egypt, procured a guard of 50 men, and displayed regal grandeur. He arose betimes in the morning, listened to disputes, and found everyone's case just, but regretted that the king would not listen to all, and would not give justice to all. He hinted that were he the judge, no one would have to complain of difficulty in obtaining his dues. Absalom pursued this course 137 for 4 years after the reconciliation with his father. He was the handsomest man of his times. He was then about 30, and in the full pride of his strength. His beautiful thick hair fell in waves over his neck and shoulders, like the mane of a lion. His affability won him the hearts of all who approached him. David was so blinded that he did not see how his crafty son was alienating the affections of the people from their sovereign, whilst Absalom merely awaited a favorable opportunity to proceed against his father, to dethrone him, and perhaps to attempt his life. This opportunity soon offered itself. It appears that David was occupied, in the last decade of his reign, with a comprehensive plan, apparently that of a great war which would require a numerous body of soldiers. He had already enlisted bands of mercenaries, 600 Hittites, who, with their general Ittai, whose admiration for David secured his unswerving attachment, had arrived from Gath. The king also wished to ascertain the number of able-bodied men over 20 years of age in all the Israelitish tribes, in order to determine whether he could undertake with their aid a campaign which would probably prove severe and tedious. The king delegated the office of numbering the men who bid their arms to his commander-in-chief, Job, and the other generals. The work of enumeration lasted 9 months and 20 days. From the numbers which were handed in, supposing them to be correct, it appears that, out of an entire population of 4 million, there were 1,300,000 men and youths capable of bearing arms. This counting of the nation, however, proved to be a mistake for which David had to pay heavily. The people were highly incensed against him. In itself the act was displeasing to them, as they saw in it the preliminaries to enlistments for a war of long duration. Added to this was the fear that the counting itself must be attended by evil results, for such was 138 to be held in those days. A fearful pestilence broke out, which carried off great numbers, and confirmed all minds in the belief that it had arisen in consequence of the numbering of the people. The capital, being densely populated, naturally suffered the greatest loss from the pestilence. On seeing the heaps of corpses, or, to speak in the metaphorical language of those days, at sight of the angel of destruction that had snatched away so many, David exclaimed, "I have sinned and done wrong, but what has my faith not done? Let thy hand strike me and the house of my fathers." The plague having snared Mount Moriah, where the Jebusites had settled, Prophet Gad bade the king erect an altar, and offer up sacrifices on that mountain, and he announced that the pestilence would then be averted from Jerusalem. Without hesitation, David and his entire court repaired thither. When the chief of the Jebusites, Orna Elana, saw David approaching, he hurried to meet him, saluted him humbly, and asked what was his desire. David then informed him that he wished to buy the mountain in order to build an altar on it. Orna graciously offered him the spot and all appertaining to it as a gift, but David refused to accept it. No sooner was an altar hastily erected there and a sacrifice offered, than the pestilence ceased in Jerusalem. From that time Mount Moriah was considered a sacred spot, which destruction could not approach. It was also the mountain on which Abraham was supposed to have offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice. In consequence of this plague the nation conceived a dislike to David. It condemned him for the loss of the thousands of human beings whom the angel of destruction had snatched away. Ahithophel made use of this dislike in order to avenge himself on David, and he employed Absalom as his tutor, and, with him, contrived a conspiracy which could not fail to succeed. 139 Absalom secretly dispatched messengers in every direction, in order to give those adherents who were already attached to him the necessary signal. The insurrection was to be set on foot in Hebron, an outpost of the tribe of Judah, whose elders had already been won for Absalom. The latter invented subterfuges by which to deceive David as to the true purpose of his visit to Hebron, and the king permitted him to depart without suspicion. Absalom arrived at Hebron, attended by his friends and guards, and by 200 prominent men of Jerusalem, whom he had invited under some pretext, and who did not suspect his real aims. These 200 men, through their very ignorance of matters, contributed to the success of the project. The people of Hebron, seeing that even prominent men had joined Absalom's party, gave up David's cause as lost. Ahithophel, who had likewise invented a pretext to absent himself from court, openly declared for Absalom, thus giving his cause an immense accession of power, as he was known to be David's right hand. The traitorous plan succeeded but too well. The Hebronites and others present saluted Absalom as king, forswore their allegiance to David, and sacrificed burnt offerings. Ambition prompted various members of David's family also to join Absalom. This was more especially the case with Amasa, his cousin, who considered himself a great commander, and thought that Job had unjustly been preferred to him. The messengers then gave the signal previously agreed upon, and the conspirators who sided with Absalom gathered together, and shouted, "Long live King Absalom!" They carried with them all who had been incensed against David for taking a census of the people, and in fact all who hoped to gain some advantage from changes and dissension. The Benjamites, whom the accession of David had deprived of supremacy, and the ever 140 dissatisfied Ephraimites, were more particularly delighted at David's downfall, and willingly did homage to the usurper. They hoped to regain their former freedom through David's misfortunes. they had greater chances of obtaining power under Absalom, who was very vain, and not likely to retain the favor of the nation for a long time, than under the rule of David. The chief towns of all the tribes sent ambassadors to Hebron to salute the new king, and his adherents daily increased in number. At first, the conspiracy was kept secret from those in authority. No one was permitted to journey to Jerusalem, lest the news spread. David received the information of his own dethronement and the accession of his son simultaneously with the news that the houses of Judah and Israel had renounced their allegiance to him. It was a terrible blow for the king, but his resolve was soon taken. He would not resort to a civil war, as the sons of Zeruiah and many other faithful followers probably urged him to do. Deserted by all the tribes, he would be obliged to shut himself up in his capital. The city would not be able to resist the attack of so large an army. And he saw, now that he was undeceived, that Absalom would not scruple to turn Jerusalem into a sea of blood. David felt deeply wounded by the alliance of Ahithophel with his usurping son, and he was greatly discouraged by it. He saw, too late, that the conspiracy was of long standing, that the plan had been maturely considered, and that resistance on his part would only lead to his own destruction. He therefore announced to his people that he would depart from Jerusalem in all haste, before Absalom could leave Hebron with his numerous followers. This step was instrumental in proving to David that he still had faithful friends, who would be true to him till death. When, on leaving his palace, he passed the place of the sellers of ointment, he observed 141 to his great joy that a great concourse followed him. Not only his general, Joab, with his brother, Abishai, and their followers. Not only a great number of the warrior court Jibrin, the hired troops, Sherethites and Pelethites, with Benai their leader, but also Ittai the Hittite, with 600 men, whom David had only a short time before enlisted. The entire population wept aloud, whilst David withdrew to the Vale of Hebron, where he mustered his followers before taking the road over the Mount of Olives to the desert near the Jordan. He did not venture to take refuge in the city from fear of treachery. Later on, the two high priests Zadok and Abiathar with all the Levites hurried after him, bearing the Ark of the Covenant with them. David, however, urged the priests to return to Zion with the Ark, saying, "If by God's mercy I shall be permitted to return to Jerusalem, then I shall again behold the Ark of the Covenant and the sanctuary. If not, if God rejects me, I am ready to endure what seemed good unto him." It also appeared to him that the priests could be of more service to him if they remained in Jerusalem than if they joined him in exile. Whilst, then, the priests hastily took the Ark back to Jerusalem, David ascended the Mount of Olives barefoot, his head covered, and his face bathed in tears. All his attendants wept bitterly. But when his grief and despair had reached their climax, a friend, who was to give him help, came from the other side of the Mount of Olives, and met him at his highest point. Hushai from the city of Erech was a confidant of David, and a counselor of no less wisdom than Ahithophel. He advanced in mourning array, his garments torn, and earth upon his head, prepared to share the king's plight. David, however, refused to permit this, because, being a mated man, he would only be a burden. In Absalom's vicinity he might do valiant service by counteracting Ahithophel's counsels, and by keeping 142 David informed of all that occurred. Hushai therefore repaired to Jerusalem. The first town through which David passed in his flight was the Benjamite city of Beth-Horon. Far from meeting with a friendly reception there, he was received with insult and neglect. A Benjamite named Shimei, of the house of Jerah, reviled and cursed him, saying, "Thou outcast and man of blood, God will repay thee for thy treatment of the house of Saul, whose crown thou hast stolen." He followed David's march for a long distance, throwing stones and earth at him, so that the soldiers had to shield the king. David, however, had some friends in Beth-Horon also. Humbled and exhausted, the king at length accomplished the journey through the desert, and reached the neighborhood of Jericho with his forces. Here he could recruit his energies after his recent bodily and mental exertions, while awaiting the news which his faithful adherents would transmit to him from Jerusalem. When David was approaching the banks of the Jordan, Absalom arrived in Jerusalem with his traitorous adherents, among them Ahithophel, David's counselor. Ahithophel urged the usurper to commit ever greater crimes in order to widen the breach between him and his father, and render a reconciliation impossible. He advised him to take possession of his father's harem. It mattered little to Ahithophel that Absalom would incur the hatred of the people through this fresh misdeed. His sole object was to revenge himself on David, and to ruin him. The weak-minded sinner who called himself king, and who was incapable of undertaking anything, unless incited thereto by others, allowed himself to be induced to commit this crime. But, whilst Absalom was reveling in sin, the man who was destined to frustrate all his ruthless plans was near at hand. Hushai had apparently submitted to the new king, and had assured him that he would serve him as 143 faithfully as he had served his father, and Absalom relied on this promise. He called a council to consider the most expedient plan for defeating and ruining his father. The elders of the tribes, who were in the city, were invited to attend. Ahithophel gave the diabolical advice to attack David the very night with a strong army, to disperse his following a sudden onslaught made by a force its superior in size and numbers, and to capture and slay the king, whom he imagined to be utterly worn out and dispirited. But Absalom also consulted Hushai with regard to the campaign against his father, and Ahithophel's advice was rejected by him as impracticable. Hushai urged such plausible objections that Absalom was duped by them. He advised that David should not be attacked with a small force, but that Absalom should raise from the entire nation Ram to Beersheba an army whose numbers would render it irresistible. Hushai's advice was more favorably received than Ahithophel's, and steps were forthwith taken to act upon it. The attack was postponed, and the campaign was deferred till the numerous forces could be assembled. Hushai immediately conveyed the result of the meeting to David by means of Jonathan and Ahimaaz, the sons of the high priest. The first result of these events was favorable to the cause of David, for Ahithophel departed from Jerusalem, and hanged himself in his native town of Shiloh. He was led to this course either by disgust at Absalom's conduct in setting aside his counsel, or by the conviction that Absalom's cause would be lost through delay, and that he himself would reap well-deserved punishment. This suicide was a severe blow to the usurper, for he had no capable man amongst his followers, and he himself was neither warlike nor prudent. His general Amasa had but little military genius. The enrollment of soldiers was actually begun, but before it could be 144 completed, David had obtained an important advantage. He went to Mahanaim, the inhabitants of which town received him with a welcome as cordial as that which in former times they had extended to the fugitive son of Saul. All the Israelites on the opposite side of the Jordan offered their assistance, and placed themselves under his command. 2 men of Gilead outbid each other in attentions to the unhappy king and father, and provided him and his followers with all necessaries. They were old men Arzalai from Rogelim, and Machir from Lo-Debar, and help came also from Shobi, king of Ammon, the son of Nahash. When at length Absalom or Amasa had succeeded in collecting a large force, they crossed the Jordan by means of rafts, and approached Mahanaim. The Absalonites encamped opposite the wood without any particular plan or order. David, on the other hand, divided his army into 3 divisions, commanded respectively by Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, who were all proved and competent soldiers. David himself was not permitted to accompany them, as his generals knew too well his love for his wicked son. The contest cost many human lives. Although Absalom's forces exceeded those of David in point of numbers, yet they were defeated, for they were not well disciplined, and were not able to find their way in the forest. David's troops, on the other hand, fought valiantly. The force was more destructive than the sword. 20,000 warriors are said to have fallen there. The force of Raphim was also the cause of Absalom's personal destruction. His long hair, of which he was very vain, caught in the branches of an oak, and the mule he had been riding galloped away. It seems providential that the death blow was dealt by Joab, who had formerly favored him, and who had thus unwittingly assisted him in his conspiracy. Joab then sounded the horn as a signal for David's army to cease from the contest, and the 145 heroes of Absalom took to flight, and crossed the Jordan. Thus ended the second civil war of David's reign, a war which was the more unnatural because of the close relationship between the rival combatants, and the sad causes which led to the contest. The first duty of the victors was to transmit the news of their triumph to David. This was in itself a painful office, for all knew how deeply David would feel the death of his wicked son. David was terrified at the news, fled from Saul, and cried repeatedly, my son, Absalom. Good, I have fallen instead of thee. The depths of a father's heart are unsearchable. Perhaps, he considered Absalom in the light of a victim whom Ahithophel had invaded and urged on to rebellion. The warriors dared not enter Mahanaim as victors, but repaired homewards stealthily, as though humiliated after a defeat. David would see and speak to no one, but mourn continually for his son's loss. At length Joab took heart, and reproached him in harsh terms for indulging in continued mourning, and thereby manifesting ingratitude towards his soldiers. In order to rouse the king, Joab further threatened that if he did not immediately show himself to his soldiers, and address them kindly, his faithful followers would leave the same night, and he would remain alone and helpless. These sharp words uttered by faithful Joab induced David to rouse himself, and appear before the people. The corpse of Absalom was thrown into a cave, and covered with a heap of stones. He left a beautiful daughter, but his 3 sons had been snatched away by death before his revolt, as though it were destined that no son of his should witness the attempt against his father's life. During his short reign at Jerusalem, he had erected a splendid monument in the King's Valley, to perpetuate his own name. Intended for his glorification, it became the commemoration of his disgrace. After 146, the close of the war, David contemplated returning to Jerusalem. He did not wish, however, to force the tribes into submission. He preferred to await their repentant return to him, and the renewal of their oaths of allegiance. It was a curious fact that the tribes of the north were the first to take this course. The voice of the people appealed to the elders to lead them back to their king. They cried, the king who delivered us from our enemies, and freed us from the yoke of the Philistines, was forced by Absalom to flee from his own country. Absalom is now dead. Why do you not hasten to bring back our king? Come, let us lead him home. Thereupon the elders of the tribes invited David to return to his capital. And thus, a second time, they acknowledged him as king. Contrary to all expectation, the tribe of Judah, and naturally the tribe of Benjamin, were still holding back. They did not move one step to welcome their king. Probably the men of Judah felt bitterly ashamed of the revolt they had started in Hebron, and did not venture to entreat David's pardon. Perhaps, too, the discontent which had incited them to forswear their allegiance was still at work amongst them. It seems that Amasa, who had fled to Jerusalem after the defeat of the force of David, still exercised great influence over the men of Judah. When David saw that the tribe of Judah was still holding aloof from him, he commanded the 2 priests, Zadok and Abiathar, who had remained in Jerusalem, to admonish the elders of Judah to invite their king to return. He told the priests to assure Amasa that he would not only receive a free pardon, but even retain his rank as general. With this prospect before him, Amasa determined to accept David's offers, and he persuaded the elders to accede to the king's proposal. The men of Judah thereupon sent an invitation to David, and an embassy went forth to meet the king, and receive him at Gilgal. The 147 men of Benjamin were sorely puzzled by this conduct. What were they to do? The Benjamites had publicly shown themselves inimical to David when he had fled from Jerusalem through their territory. They had not thought it possible that he would ever return, and reclaim his throne. Now affairs had changed, and not only the northern tribes, but even Judah was preparing to do him homage. The Benjamites felt no attachment to David, but they could not isolate themselves, for then the king's wrath would fall heavily on them. Shimei, whose insults had caused David such bitter pain during his flight, and who, in consequence, had most cause to fear the king's anger, advised that they should display intense enthusiasm for David's cause, exceeding that of the other tribes, since, by appealing to his generosity, they might incline him favorably towards them. In obedience to this advice, 1,000 Benjamites went forward to meet David, joined the Judah embassy, and, on arriving at the bank of the Jordan, threw a bridge across the river in order to facilitate the king's transit. Meanwhile, the king had left Mahanaim, and was approaching the Jordan, attended by his court, his servants, and the faithful followers who had joined him on the opposite shore. Shimei advanced before all the others, threw himself at the king's feet as he was about to cross the river, acknowledged his fault, and entreated David's forgiveness. David now returned with a larger concourse of followers and had accompanied him on his flight across the Jordan. He was attended by the Judah embassy, by 1,000 Benjamites, and by the faithful friends who formed his guard of honor. The first town reached after crossing the Jordan was Gilgal. Here the ambassadors of the different tribes on this side of the river were assembled to renew their homage. They felt surprised and annoyed that the Judahites had stolen a march on them by meeting the king at the very shore of the Jordan 148 based on this sneering display of loyalty, which they did not consider sincere, and effort on the part of the house of Judah to regain the king's favor, to the detriment of the house of Israel. The elders of Israel made no secret of their displeasure, and gave vent to it in David's presence. The Judahites, however, retaliated on them. The question of presidency degenerated into a violent quarrel, the Judahites making angry retorts, thus offending the northern tribes still more. Bitter animosity arose between the contending parties. David appears to have inclined to the side of the Judahites. Sheba, a Benjamite of the family of Bichri, taking advantage of the general confusion, sounded the trumpet and cried, "We have no portion in David, and no share in the son of Jesse. Let every Israelite return to his tent." Heeding this cry, the elders of the northern tribes withdrew, and followed Sheba the Bichriite. The men of Judah alone remained faithful to David, and accompanied him to Jerusalem. The joy of their return was mingled with annoyance. A fresh breach had arisen. The civil war was ended. At the that juncture David could recourse to a step which may be considered either very wise or very foolish. Joab had become obnoxious to him since the king had learned that he had killed Absalom, and David did not wish him to fill the office of general any longer. Besides this, he desired to keep his word with Absalom, and to appoint him to the office of commander-in-chief. David, being now dependent on the tribe of Judah, felt the necessity of retaining Amasa goodwill, as the latter's influence had immense weight with the Gibeonites. Without consulting Joab, he commanded Amasa to summon the forces of the tribe of Judah within 3 days, in order to proceed against the rebels. The time expired, and Amasa did not return. David became uneasy. He thought Amasa might have deceived him, and made common cause with the insurgents. It was necessary 149 to be expeditious, lest Sheba's followers increase in numbers, and also gain time to occupy fortified cities. David had no choice but to turn to the sons of Zeruiah, who, in their unswerving fidelity, had remained true to him in spite of frequent slights, and whose skill in matters of war he had amply tested. David would not, however, give the supreme command to Joab, but entrusted it to his brother Abishai. He set out with the Cherethites and Pelethites, who were to form the nucleus of the army which he hoped to collect on the way. Joab overlooked the insult which had been offered him, and joined the troops, or rather became their leader. He appears to have issued an appeal to the people to gather around him. When Amasa joined them in Gibeon, Joab killed him with one stroke of his sword, and the Gibeonites, whom Amasa had collected, followed the sons of Zeruiah. In all the towns, fresh partisans and followers attached themselves to David's cause. Sheba found but few adherents, the northern tribes being unwilling to begin a civil war for the sake of a man who was but little known, and who was followed only by a small band of soldiers. He had thrown himself into the fortified town of Abel, and a part of his followers occupied the town of Dan, which lay at 10 hours' distance from the base of Mount Hermon, not far from the source of the Jordan. Joab quickly ordered a trench to be dug around the town of Abel, and without calling on the inhabitants to surrender, he began to undermine the walls. The inhabitants became greatly alarmed. Then a wise woman called from the wall to sappers below to summon Joab. When he approached, she addressed him reproachfully, "Thou shouldst then ask first in Abel and then that thou mightest have heard, whether all those who are faithful and peace-loving have departed from Israel. Why wilt thou slaughter the mothers and the children of Israel? Why wilt thou destroy the inheritance 150 of Jacob?" Joab replied that he did not wish to do this, that he merely desired to capture the man who had lifted his hands against the king. On this the woman promised that the head of the rebel should soon be thrown over the wall. She kept her word, for she secretly persuaded her fellow citizens to separate Sheba from his few followers, and to kill him. His gory head was cast over the wall, and Joab raised the siege, dismissed his soldiers, and returned to Jerusalem with the news of his victory. The king was obliged, against his will, to leave him in command of the army. David returned to his capital with a purged soul. He had suffered and atoned heavily for his sins. He had taken away the wife of his faithful servant, and his son had taken away his wives. He had spilled Uriah's blood, and the streams of blood shed in his own house had almost overwhelmed him. He had found by bitter experience that even the best king cannot build on his people's love. His plan of undertaking a great war against his heathen foes was shattered. He, therefore, in his old age, during the last years of his reign, confined his attention to the internal affairs of his kingdom. He wished to carry out, before death overtook him, an idea he had long cherished. He wished to build a magnificent temple to the God of Israel, who had rescued him in his many troubles. Before commencing, David consulted Nathan, the prophet. For in those days the prophet ranked higher than the priest. He said, "I live in a palace of cedar wood, whilst the ark of God is only in a temporary tent. I will build a temple of cedar for it." Nathan approved the plan and said, "Carry out all that is in thy heart, for God is with thee." The next day, however, the prophet came to him, and revealed to David that he was not destined to build a temple, because he had shed blood, but that this task would be reserved for his son. At the same time David was informed that his throne 151 was established for many years to come, that a long succession of kings would descend from him, and occupy his throne, provided that they walked in the ways of God. Much as David had wished to build a stately temple in Jerusalem, he bowed humbly to the divine decree revealed to him by Nathan, and gave up his project. Before the Ark of the Covenant, he thanked God in a heartfelt prayer for the mercies bestowed on him, who had been raised up from the dust. His heart was filled with gratitude that his royal house and his throne were to be established for many years to come. David gave expression to his feeling in a song, which, however, has not the same word of his former songs. It was, perhaps, his last poetic prayer. Although David did not commence the erection of the temple himself, he began to make the necessary preparations. He devoted to the sanctuary a part of the boon which he had acquired from the conquered nations. He also regulated the order in which divine services were to be conducted, by having, according to Samuel's method, choirs of Levites to play on the harp and sing songs, in addition to the ordinary sacrificial rites. He is also considered the inventor of the various musical instruments which were later on introduced into the service. David's vital energy began to decrease before he had attained his 71st year. The anxieties of his youth, constant warfare, the exciting events in his own family, Amnon's sinfulness and Absalom's revolt caused him to grow old at a comparatively early age. He felt no warmth in his body. He felt cold despite the torpid of Jerusalem, and all the clothes which he could procure did not seem to supply him with the necessary vital heat. Adonijah, the king's fourth son, endeavored, by taking advantage of David's failing powers, to secure the succession. He was the next heir after Amnon and Absalom, but he feared that he might 152 be passed over if he awaited the death of his father, and he had probably heard of secret understanding, according to which the son of Bathsheba, his youngest brother, was to succeed to the throne. Adonijah had no desire to rebel against his father as Absalom had done. He merely wished to have his right to the succession recognized by the chief dignitaries of the kingdom. He therefore took counsel with those of David's court who were opposed to Solomon's succession. Foremost amongst these was Joab, who supported him as he had formerly supported Absalom. Adonijah's other confidant was Abiathar, the second of the high priests, who seems to have been placed in an inferior position by David. Zadok, whose family had been appointed hereditary high priests by Saul at Gibeon, had been retained in that position by David, who wished to secure his support, and therefore bestowed upon him the highest rank in the sanctuary. Abiathar may have felt hurt by this neglect, and perhaps took the part of Adonijah in order to secure the position he could not hope to obtain under Solomon. The other sons of the king also wished to see the throne assured to Adonijah, and thus intrigues at the court commenced afresh. Adonijah was as handsome and as popular as Absalom had been, and also, it appears, as thoughtless and as unfit for government. Like Absalom, he began to draw the eyes of the people upon himself by a truly royal display. He procured chariots and attendants on horseback, and kept a guard of 50 runners, who preceded him wherever he went. David was weak in his behavior to him, as he had been to Absalom, permitted him to have his own way, and thus tacitly acknowledged him as his successor. One day Adonijah invited his confidants, Joab, Abiathar, and all the king's sons excepting Solomon, to a meeting. They offered up sacrifices near a well, and during the feast his followers cried, "Long live King Adonijah." 153. The first to take exception to Adonijah's proceedings was Nathan the prophet. He knew of the secret promise, given by David to his wife Bathsheba, that Solomon should inherit the crown. He had also revealed to David that Solomon was appointed by God to be his successor. He seems to have had confidence in Solomon's character, and to have expected better things from him than from Adonijah. Nathan, therefore, went to Bathsheba, and they devised a plan by which Adonijah's king might be overthrown. Bathsheba then repaired to the king, reminded him of his oath, and directed his attention to the fact that, in the event of Adonijah's succession, she and her son both would be lost, and her marriage would be branded with ignominy. Hardly had she ended the description of the Sabbath which awaited her as Solomon's claims were satisfied, when the prophet Nathan was announced, and confirmed her assertions. David's resolve was quickly taken, and carried into effect on the same day, for he was most anxious to keep his oath to leave the scepter to Solomon. He called upon the dignitaries who had not conspired with Adonijah, on Zadok, and the warriors, and announced to them his resolve that Solomon should be anointed king during his own lifetime, and they all solemnly promised to acknowledge Solomon. Thereupon, David summoned the Cherethites and Pelethites to attend his son. Solomon then mounted one of the royal mules, and proceeded to the valley of Gihon, to the west of the town. A crowd of people joined the procession, and when the high priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan had anointed him with oil from the tent of the sanctuary, the soldiers blew their trumpets, and all the people cried, "Long live King Solomon!" Great excitement now prevailed in Jerusalem, while the eastern mountains echoed with the cry of "Long live King Adonijah." The western chain 154 was resounding with shouts of "Long live King Solomon!" Had both the king's sons and their adherents remained obstinate, a civil war must have ensued. But Adonijah was not like Absalom. He did not wish to excite a rebellion, nor would his chief supporters, Joab and Abiathar, have assisted him in such an attempt. No sooner did Adonijah hear that Solomon had been anointed king by his father's command than his courage failed him. He hastened to the sanctuary at Zion in order to seek refuge in the Holy of Holies. Solomon, however, who had immediately taken the reins of government, sent to inform him that he might leave the sanctuary, that not a hair of his head should be touched so long as he did not attempt any fresh revolt. Adonijah then repaired to the young king, paid him due homage, and was dismissed with presents. Thus the contest for the succession ended. David's weakness gradually increased, until after a stormy reign of 40 years and 6 months 1015, he expired peacefully. He was the first to occupy a place in the royal mausoleum which he had built in a rocky cave on the southern slope of Mount Zion. David's death was deeply mourned. He had made the nation great, independent and happy, and death transfigured him. When he had passed away, the nation began to realize the true value of his work, and what he had done to them. He had reunited the various tribes, each of which before followed its own special interests, and he formed them into one nation. The revolts of Absalom and Sheba proved sufficiently how strong the feeling had become which bound the tribes together. The house of Israel did not seize the opportunity offered by his death of severing itself from the house of Judah, and great as was their jealousy of each other, they held together. David had removed every inducement for party divisions, and had knit them together with a kind but firm hand. During his reign the 155 priesthood and the prophets worked amicably together. Thus Solomon was anointed by the high priest Zadok in conjunction with the prophet Nathan. David maintained friendly relations between the priestly houses of Eliezer and Ithamar, represented by Zadok and Abiathar respectively. The nation had no reason to contain a repression, for he dealt justly to the extent of his own motive. By destroying the power of the Philistines, who had so long held the neighboring tribes in subjection, and by conquering the nations inhabiting the banks of the Euphrates, he had not only established eternal prosperity, but had also founded a great empire which could vie in power with Egypt, and had cast into the shade the Chaldean and Assyrian kingdoms on the Euphrates and the Tigris. By this means he had roused the people to the proud consciousness that it constituted a mighty nation of the Lord, the possessor of the law of God, the superior of the neighboring nations. David's sins were gradually forgotten, for his atonement had been both grievous and manifold. Posterity pronounced a milder judgment on him than did his contemporaries. The remembrance of his great deeds, his kindness, his obedience to God, caused him to appear invested with the traits of an ideal king, who served as a pattern to all later rulers, he who had always walked in the ways of God, and never departed therefrom. The kings of his house who succeeded him were measured by a standard, and were judged by the extent of their resemblance to him. David's reign shone through the ages as perfect, as one in which power and humility, fear of God and peace were united. Every succeeding century added its tribute to David's character, until he became the ideal of a virtuous king and sacred poet. 156. Chapter 9 Solomon. The new king's rule. Solomon's choice. Void of allegory. Murder of Adonijah and Joab. The court. Alliance with Egypt. Tyre. Solomon's building. The plan of the temple. The workmen. The materials. Description of the temple. The ceremony of consecration. Reorganization of the priesthood. The king's house. The throne. Increase of national wealth. The fleet. The seeds of disunion. Jeroboam. Idolatry permitted. Estrangement from Egypt. Growth of surrounding kingdoms. Solomon's fame. His death. 1015-977 BCE. David had left affairs in Israel in such perfect order that his successor, unless he were a fool or knave, or the victim of evil advice, would have but little trouble in governing. Solomon, however, carried David's work still further. He shed such luster upon Israel that even the most distant generations basked in the light that emanated from his wise rule. Indeed, a king who solidifies and increases, if he does not actually found, the greatness of the state. Who permits his people the enjoyment of peace. Who sheds the bounties of plenty over his land, driving poverty away from the meanest level. Who opens up new channels for the development of his people's powers, and who thus increases and strengthens them. A king who has the intelligence to allow his subjects to exercise their mental gifts, and cultivate their love of the beautiful. Who, by his material and spiritual creations, elevates his country to the dignity of a model state, such as had never been before him and scarcely ever after him. Adonijah assuredly deserves the high praise which posterity has accorded to him. 157 Carried away by the greatness of his deeds, or all these grand characteristics were strikingly prominent in Solomon, and shut their eyes to his weaknesses, and considered them the inevitable result of human imperfection. In the first place, he strove to preserve peace for his country, though his father had left ample means for making fresh conquests. He was called the King of Peace Shlomo. By giving to his people the comforts of prosperity, he widened its horizon, and raised its self-respect. He ruled it with wisdom and justice, and decided with strict impartiality all contests between individuals as well as tribes. He increased the number of towns, and secured the safety of the roads and of the caravans. He filled the city of Jerusalem with splendor, and built therein a magnificent temple in honor of God. He himself cultivated the fine arts and poetry, and thereby endowed them with fresh attractions in the eyes of the people.
Hey, Glatastic.
Lastly, he set great gains for the nation, and was rightly called the wise king.
Sweetie.
History, the impartial arbitress, cannot, however, be
always
blinded
think
by
of
his
her
dancing
as
virtues to the blemishes which attached to his government,
Wow.
and which must be accounted the cause of the unfortunate breach which commenced when his reign was scarcely closed. The beginning of Solomon's rule was not free from stains of blood, and its end was clouded with mists, which dimmed its brightness. His love of splendor became injurious to morality. It made him despotic, and imposed a burden on the people, which it bore for a considerable time, but shook off at the first favorable opportunity. Solomon converted the kingly power into an autocracy, under which every will had to be subservient to his. But these blemishes were entirely hidden by the greatness of the achievements under his rule. It is impossible now to decide how far the responsibility of Solomon for these evils goes, how much of the blame rests with his two officious servants, and to what extent their 158 existence must be attributed to the irresistible force of circumstances, to which the exalted and the lowly alike must submit. It is the curse of crowned heads that the worthiest wearer of a crown, in order to consolidate his power, is induced to take steps which his conscience would under other circumstances condemn, and the misdeeds of his servants are also added to his account. Solomon was young, hardly 20, and he ascended the throne. After his accession, whilst visiting the altar at Gibeon, we are told, he had a vision in which God asked him to express the innermost wish of his heart, with the promise that it should be fulfilled. He did not choose long life, nor riches, nor honor, nor the death of his enemies. But he chose wisdom, in order that he might rule his people with justice. In fact, this wisdom, this power of entering into the feelings and minds of the dissenting parties who appeared before him, of seizing on the true state of the case in spite of exaggeration and subtle arguments, Solomon possessed to an extraordinary degree. His Solomonic judgment is well known. By giving a verdict which was well adapted to reveal the real feeling of a mother, he recognized, in a dispute between two women for the possession of a child, on which side was true, on which side falsehood. Cut the child in half, he said. But its real mother could not accept this decision, and offered rather to give up her child. He was determined that no one in his kingdom should suffer from injustice. Though he may not have been the first that uttered the saying, the justice of crown is established, yet it was not enough in his own heart. The wisdom of Solomon is also displayed to great advantage in another direction, namely, in his poetic productions. These were chiefly allegorical poems national. In them he caused the lofty cedars of Lebanon, and the lowly creeping wall plants, to appear as the emblems of what is highest, and 159 humbleness, quadrupeds, birds of the air, reptiles, and even dumb fish are given voice and speech. Each of these fables probably ended with an appropriate moral lesson.
I saw.
It has been believed that Solomon composed 3,000 of such fables and 5,000 songs or proverbs. But Solomon was by no means the originator of this style of fiction. Long before him, such compositions had been common among the Israelites. Standing on Mount Gerizim, Jotham, the son of the judge Gideon, addressed the misguided people of Shechem in an ingenious parable. The prophet Nathan had disguised his exhortation to David respecting the sin of Bathsheba in the form of a parable. But though not even nearly failed to culture, Solomon is still deserving of praise for the time left occupied by the cares of government to its further development.
So seal
His
name.
rare qualities of mind were displayed in yet another direction. In some of his compositions he delineates types of persons and things by means of allusions, the hidden meaning of which is left to guessing. Such enigmas, presented in a poetic form, were in those days the favorite diversions of social gatherings and feasts, and Solomon possessed remarkable ingenuity in devising these recreations of the human mind. He was, however, guilty of errors, the greater part of which arose from an exaggerated idea of his royal dignity, and from imitating the kings of the neighboring states of
I like how you're doing this with the world.
almost interesting and mortal, namely, that of being considered identical with the state, now all insists were to center in him, and all else was to be of comparatively little importance. Solomon's wisdom ran aground on this rock. The truth of Samuel's prediction, at the time of the election of a ruler, was better proven by the wise king than by his predecessors. 160, unfortunately, Solomon was a younger son, to whom the throne had been allotted contrary to the ordinary laws of succession, whilst Adonijah, whom a portion of the people had recognized as king, was considered the rightful heir. So long as the latter lived, Solomon's government could not be on a firm basis, and he could never feel himself secure. Adonijah, therefore, had to be removed. The leader of the bodyguard, now, forcibly entered his house, and killed him. As an excuse for this act of violence, it was asserted that Adonijah had attempted to win the hand over this man, the young widow of David, and thus had revealed his traitorous intention of contesting his brother's right to the throne. No sooner had he fallen than Job, the former adherent of Adonijah, feared that a similar fate would overtake him. This exemplary general, who had contributed so considerably to the aggrandizement of the people of Israel and the power of the house of David, fled to the altar on Mount Zion, and clung to it, hoping to escape death. Now, however, refused to respect his place of refuge, and shed his blood at the altar. In order to excuse this crime, it was given out that David himself, on his deathbed, had impressed on his successor the duty of avenging the death of Abner and Amasa. Job, who had killed them in times of peace, was not to be allowed, in spite of his venerable age, to die in peace. It is uncertain whether Nag was Solomon's evil advisor, or merely his instrument. Job's death was the cause of great joy amongst the enemies of Israel, and aroused in them the courage to fight a rebellion. Adonijah's priestly partisan,
Good job.
Abiathar,
I
whom
saw.
Solomon did not dare touch, was deprived of his office as high priest, and Zadok was made the sole head of the priesthood, and his descendants, invested with that dignity, maintained it for over 1,000 years, whilst the offspring of Abiathar were neglected. He Benjamite Shimei, who had pursued 161 David with execrations on his flight from Jerusalem, was also executed, and it was only through this threefold deed of blood that Solomon's throne appears to have gained stability. Solomon then directed his attention to the formation of a court of the greatest magnificence, such as was befitting the powerful king whose commands were obeyed from the boundaries of Egypt to the banks of the Euphrates. In those days, many wives were considered a necessary adjunct to the king's dignity. David had about 16 wives, but this was an insignificant number as compared with that of the kings of Egypt and Phisha, whom Solomon had taken for his pattern. It was only in compliance with this common but corrupt practice that Solomon formed an immense harem. His first wife was Naamah the Beautiful, an Ammonite princess. He also had other wives from the Moabite and Aramean courts, and even from those of the Hittite and Canaanite kings. But what most gratified his pride was that the Egyptian king Sisera gave him his daughter in marriage. Solomon thought that in acting thus he had taken a wise step, and that his country and his dynasty would be benefited by the alliance. But the result proved the contrary. The daughter of Sisera was naturally received with every mark of attention in the Israelitish capital. She became the first queen in Solomon's harem, but it seemed to him a disgrace that he could not place a magnificent house at the disposal of this queen. What was the seat house built by David on Mount Zion, when compared with the gigantic edifices and labyrinthine palaces of the kings of Egypt? Solomon, therefore, determined to build a palace worthy of her. Through the alliance with Egypt, innovations of great consequence were made in Israel, among them the introduction of horses and chariots. Solomon also entered into close and friendly connection 162 with Hiram, king of Tyre, with whom David had already established a neighborly intimacy. He appears to have married a daughter of Hiram, too, and this close bond between Solomon and Hiram seems to have led to important and extensive undertakings. The establishment of a large harem demanded an immense body of servants. Solomon maintained the most brilliant court. The ambassadors of tributary and friendly powers had to be received with great pomp, for Solomon laid great stress on the display of splendor, and the maintenance of his court demanded the expenditure of large sums of money. As he could not otherwise obtain means, the royal house not having extensive estates in its own right, the people had to defray his enormous expenses. The whole land was divided into 12 parts, and a governor was placed over each division to see that the inhabitants contributed 1 month's provisions every year. The purpose of this division seems to have been that the old system of tribal organization might cease. A superior, or vizier, whose duty it was to see that the tribute of natural products was sent in regularly, was appointed over these 12 officials. Solomon displayed heightened grandeur in his buildings. He was anxious in the first instance to raise a splendid temple to the God of Israel in the capital of his country. It could not be a matter of indifference to him that in the neighboring lands of Egypt and Phisha, with the rulers of which he was intimately acquainted, gigantic temples were raised for the various gods, whilst in his country the sanctuary was merely placed in a tent. Solomon, therefore, immediately after his accession to the throne, made preparations for commencing the erection of a sacred edifice. The site was already chosen. It was to be on Mount Moriah, to the northeast of the city, where David had raised an altar after the 160 great festivals had ceased. Silver and gold had been collected for the purpose, but building materials, stone and cedar was sent and procured. 3 stones and blocks had been hewn from the rocks and the quarries north of Jerusalem, where they were so dovetailed as to be easily joined after reaching the spot. But whence procure workmen for this troublesome business of hewing, preparing and conveying the stones? Solomon had learned from Pharaoh Sisera, his father-in-law, the means of obtaining workmen without incurring heavy expense. He employed the remnant of the Canaanite population still living in the country. Although Saul had begun to decrease their numbers, he could not proceed against them with his full strength, on account of his continual strife with David. David had left them undisturbed, so they lived quietly, peace peaceably with the Israelites, and served the king faithfully in his wars against the Philistines and other nations. Solomon, on the contrary, declared the remnant of the Ammonites, Hittites, Perizzites and Hivites, as well as the Gossips whom David had permitted to live in the outskirts of Jerusalem, to be bondmen, and compelled them to perform their part of slavery. They numbered 150,000 youths and able-bodied men, and comprised the working class. More than 3,000 Israeli superintendents carried encouraged natives to their work. A superior officer, Adonai, watched over the superintendents and the workmen. 80,000 of these unhappy beings worked in the stone quarries day and night by light of us. They were under the direction of a man from the student, who understood the art of hewing heavy blocks from the rocks, and of giving the edges the necessary shape for dovetailing. 20,000 slaves removed the heavy blocks from the mouth of the quarry, and carried them to the building site. Hiram, the king of Tyre, Solomon's friend, supplied 164 cedar and cypress wood. Trees were felled on Lebanon, for which purpose Hiram placed skilled workmen at Solomon's disposal. The trunks were forwarded from Lebanon to Tyre or to the other harbors, whence they were conveyed in rafts to the port of Jaffa, and from there with much toil over hills and dales to Jerusalem, a distance of at least a 10-hour journey. As the Canaanite slaves were not sufficiently numerous to remove the cedar and cypress trees, and to convey them to their destination, Solomon employed Israelites to assist in the work, 30,000 being impressed for the duty. Each 10,000 were sent for a month to work in the forests, to fell the trees, and convey them to their destination. After a month had passed, the workmen were relieved by another body of 10,000. These 30,000 Israelites were not considered to remain free, and even received wages if they were not allowed to withdraw voluntarily from the work. It was not to be expected that Hiram would cut down his cedar and cypress forests, or that he would place carpenters and builders at Solomon's disposal without receiving some return. So long as the buildings were in course of erection, Solomon sent him annually a certain amount of corn, wine and oil, with the raising of which tribute the people were probably taxed. But Hiram was also obliged to advance gold for the adornment of the interior of the temple. Solomon's fleet had not yet imported the precious metal. In return for the supply of gold, Solomon yielded up to Hiram 20 towns of the borderland, in the tribe of Asher, between Phisha and the territory of Israel. Though these were not important, and did not please Hiram, still it was a transference of Israelitish territory to the Phishitians. Hiram permitted various races to colonize the towns, from whom the territory received the name Jelohamboy in the district of nations, later Galilee 165. As soon as the stones and blocks of wood had been removed to the building site of the temple, the erection of which was to occupy 3 years, the work was commenced. The temple was built with freestone, and the walls were covered with cedar planks on the inside. On these were traced designs of palms, open flower cups, and Peruvian winged heads with human faces, and these designs were inlaid with gold. The temple was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. It was divided into the Holy of Holies Dever, the inner chamber, a square of 20 cubits, and the holy place Hekel, which was 40 cubits long. The Holy of Holies seems to have been situated on higher ground than the sanctuary. At the sides were 2 Peruvian of fluted olive wood, each 10 cubits high, the wings of which were 5 cubits wide. At the entrance of the sanctuary was an open vestibule within, which was of the same width as the sanctuary, and 10 cubits in length, and in front of this hall there were artistically wrought columns of bronze. The artist, Hiram, was a half-Jew, his father being Assyrian and his mother a Naphthalite. The Holy of Holies was to face the west, contrary to the custom of the Gentiles, whose temples faced the rising sun. The gates were of olive wood, adorned with gilded cherubim as well as with palms and flower cups. The folding doors of the sanctuary, made of cypress wood, were ornamented in a like manner, and the floor was of cypress wood inlaid with gold. In the Holy of Holies nothing was visible but the cherubim, intended to enshrine the Ark of the Covenant, in which the tablets of the law were kept. In the sanctuary there was an altar of cedar wood gilded on all sides, with 5 gilded candlesticks at each side, and a large gilded table for 12 loaves. The temple was surrounded by an extensive courtyard. Inside the vestibule stood a large iron altar, and a spacious water reservoir, 166 tall BIRC, adorned with a border of open flower cups and lily buds, and on the lower part with colonnades. This reservoir was supported by 12 iron bowls, each 3 of which turned in a different direction. The water was intended for washing the hands and feet of the officiating priests whenever they entered the sanctuary, the flow of water probably being regulated by a faucet. 10 small masoned on wheels, artistically engraved, could be pushed to any spot where they might be wanted. Vessels for the sacrificial rites were cast in large quantities by the order of the king. The whole building inside and outside was stamped with the impressive wealth and grandeur. At the completion of the building, it was consecrated 1007, with solemn rites. The erection of the temple had occupied 7 years, and the month selected for the consecration was that in which the harvest and the vintage were completed. The chiefs of all the tribes and the elders of families were invited, and people streamed from every quarter to gaze in astonishment at the splendors of the temple, and to look upon the unaccustomed spectacle. The solemnities commenced with the transfer of the ark from Mount Zion, the town of David, to Mount Moriah. The bars attached to the ark were those which had been used during the wanderings in the desert. They were so placed that all present could see that holy relic of past ages, the 2 stone tables inscribed with the 10 commandments. During the transfer of the Ark of the Covenant, and during the consecration, many thousands of sacrifices were offered, and also psalms were sung. No sooner had the Ark of the Covenant been brought into the Holy of Holies than a thick cloud filled the body of the temple, so that the all nights were interrupted in no service. This was considered a token of God's mercy, and a sign that the consecration had been performed in accordance with Israel. The vast assembly was thus swayed by the feelings of joy, piety, and devotion. The king gave expression to 167 the general sentiments in a few brave words. God has promised to dwell in the cloud. I have built a dwelling for thee, O God, and abode for thee to dwell in forever. Mount Moriah thus appeared like Mount Sinai, where the voice of God had served from out of the dense cloud. The temple became an object of veneration to the people, who believed that from between the 2 cherubim, God would make known to them the ways in which they were to walk. The prophet who was present, perhaps Ahijah of Shiloh, announced to King Solomon in the name of God, If thou wilt walk in my law, and obey my commands, and fulfill my behests, then I will fulfill unto thee the promise I made unto David, thy father I shall dwell in the midst of the sons of Israel, and I will not desert my people. The nation celebrated the autumn festivals, which occurred simultaneously with the consecration, most joyfully. Deep and lasting was the impression made by this temple, gleaming with gold and bronze, sumptuous and imposing in its structure, containing no visible image of the deity, yet filled with his invisible presence. The house of God offered something tangible to those whose imaginations could not conceive of the spiritual, divested of material form. The temple was the pride and strength of Israel, and the delight of its eyes. At the time of the consecration there was inaugurated a religious service, such as had been impossible within the narrow limits of the sanctuary in Shiloh or, during the transition period, in the tent at Zion. A priesthood had certainly existed even in former times, and belonged exclusively to the descendants of Aaron. It was, however, only under Solomon that a high priest was put at the head of the others, and that gradations in rank were introduced. Azariah, the son of Zadok, was advanced to the office of high priest after the death of his father, and was assisted by the inferior priests. A new order of service was arranged for the Levites, 168 who were subordinate to the priests. A part of them assisted at the sacrificial services. Another part kept guard at 4 sides of the temple, and were charged with the care of the sacred vessels, and with all preparations for the temple service. Lastly, certain families took part in the singing and the instrumental music that accompanied the services. It was the temple within order of worship introduced there that actually raised Jerusalem to the position of the capital of the country. Pilgrims from all the tribes attended the autumnal festivals there, in order to witness the solemn divine services, such as could be held at no tribal altar. Jerusalem, gradually becoming an important commercial town, in which foreign goods and curiosities were displayed, attracted ever greater numbers of visitors from all the tribes. Thus the youngest of the cities in the land of Israel surpassed and outshone all the older towns. Solomon gave orders that the capital be fortified on all sides, and that the temple also be included within the line of fortifications. The erection of the royal palace occupied a period of more than 13 years. It consisted of a series of buildings which extended over a great area on the northern hill, in the quarter called Millo. Next to the entrance was the house of the Forest of Lebanon, which took its name from the numerous pillars of cedar, which were ranged in rows of 15 each. This house served as the armory for the king's protection. Here 1,300 guards kept watch. They were provided with spears and shields of gold, and acted as the king's attendants when he proceeded to the temple. Great attention was given by Solomon to the fitting up of the judgment or throne chamber. The walls from the floor to the ceiling were covered with cedar wood, and adorned with gold fretwork. In this hall Solomon's throne was placed. It was considered a marvel of workmanship. It was ornamented with 169 ivory, and inlaid with gold. 6 steps led up to it, and on each step were 2 artistically wrought lions, the symbols of power and of royal dignity. The seat was supported on each side by arms, and on it also were 2 lions. In the hall of public justice Solomon heard contesting parties, and pronounced judgment. He considered his office of judge one of the holiest and most important connected with his kingly dignity. Here he also received the ambassadors of the various countries, who attended his court to offer their homage, or to negotiate new treaties. A special palace was built for the king, his servants and his wives, a separate house being reserved for the Egyptian princess. It appears that her removal from David's house to her own residence was effected with great pomp. Probably Solomon had also an aqueduct built so as to supply the town of Jerusalem and the temple with water from the rich spring of Edom, which was at a 2 hours' journey from Jerusalem. The practice of building splendid edifices of cedar was not confined to Solomon. The great nobles and princes who lived in Jerusalem, the high officers, and his favorites, all followed his example. With the wealth that streamed into the land through the opening of 3 important channels, the love of show, which spread from the king to the higher classes, could be duly gratified. The Egyptian merchants of high standing, who carried on a large wholesale trade, money changers, men of wealth who lent money on interest, now settled in Jerusalem. They composed a special corporation or guild, and were under the protection of the treaty between Solomon and Hiram. They were permitted to live according to their own laws, and were even allowed to practice their religious rather, idolatrous rites. The three great sources of wealth were the powerful position of the state, the alliance with Egypt, and the Indian trade. Those princes who ventured once on the anti-treaty did confirm them with his successor, and other potentates sought his friendship. On swearing allegiance, all these princes and nations sent the customary tribute and rich gifts, such as gold and silver vessels, valuable garments, spices, horses, and mules. The alliance with Egypt was also the source of considerable additions to the national wealth, as that kingdom furnished forces to the mountainous districts, and war chariots, which were in great demand in foreign parts. The princes of Aaron and of the territories on the Euphrates who had formerly procured their horses and chariots from Egypt, were to buy these war materials from Solomon's merchant guild. The latter established a station for his own riders and horses on the plain not far from the sea. He kept 12,000 horses and 1,400 war chariots, each drawn by 2 horses, and for these he erected spacious buildings, containing 4,000 stalls. Solomon's greatest gains, however, were acquired in trade with India. To the Egyptians, the journey to this distant country was attended with insuperable difficulties, so long that the country near the Red Sea was rendered unsafe by the uncivilized and predatory bands that dwelt there. By his alliance with Hiram, Solomon had opened up a safer and nearer route to India. The strip of land extending from the southern border of Judah to the eastern coast of the Red Sea, the points Ela and Isaiah River, had been rendered accessible. Caravans with their loaded camels could proceed in safety from Jerusalem and from the coast to the northern points of the Red Sea. At Hiram's suggestion, Solomon had a fleet of strong and large ships of Tarshish built, and equipped on the coast of Isaiah River. Hiram sent his most skillful sailors, who knew the route thoroughly, to man the vessels. Israelites of the tribes of Asher and Zebulun, who lived on the coast and were acquainted with the sea, were also employed. Once anyone when the Israeli fleet was complete, it sailed out of the harbor of Isaiah River to the Red Sea, which separates Palestine from Egypt, Nubia, and Abyssinia, and proceeded along the coast to the Gulf which washes the shores of southern Arabia, as far as the mouth of the Indus, in the land of Ophir now called Sin. After a period of 2 years, Solomon's fleet returned richly laden with the proceeds of this first expedition. Vast droves of camels carried the treasures to Jerusalem, to the great astonishment of the whole population. More than 400 talents kikar of gold, silver in great quantities, ivory, ebony, apes, and exquisitely colored peacocks, sandalwood, and sweet-smelling plants were thus transported. Solomon caused a throne to be made of the ivory, and the sandalwood was used for ornamenting the harps and boots of the musicians who played in the temple. The paintings of the bridge which led from the palace to the temple were also made of this rare and costly wood. Solomon sent his fleet several times to Ophir or India, and each time new riches and curiosities were brought into the country. The port Elath became a place of great importance. Judah settled there, and the land of Israel thus extended from the extreme end of the Red Sea to the Euphrates. In order to convey horses and chariots from Aram to the Euphrates, as also the various importations from Phoenicia, roads had to be made, and measures taken to ensure the safety of the caravans. In a mountainous country, it is not easy for beasts of burden, and certainly not for horses and chariots, to traverse great distances, obstructed as the way is by steep cliffs, abrupt precipices, and masses of rolling stones. Solomon, however, had roads made which led from Jerusalem to the north. These are the king's high roads. He probably employed the services of the Canaanite natives, who were obliged as bondmen to take part in his work. Heights were leveled, depths filled 172 up, and stones removed. The roads were passable by carriages, which could proceed without hindrance from the south to the north, and the caravans passing from the Jordan to the sea could travel without difficulty. The chain of fortresses protected the roadways, and served as resting places. Besides these stations for riders and carriages, Solomon also founded towns for storing goods. These were also used to house grain for future years of scarcity. Thus Solomon settled the affairs of Israel, and provided for its future security. He had no short-sighted counselor, such as David had Ahithophel, to assist him in establishing order. His own wisdom was his sole counselor. But he had to choose responsible officers, who would give effect to his instructions, and carry out the plans which he devised. The great extent of his state and his court demanded the establishment of new offices. For the better reception of strangers he had placed over his vast household a Major General al-Habdate. Abishar was the name of this officer. The 12 officials he provided for the wants of the household were supervised by a chief whose name was Azariah ben Nathan. A high official, Adoram, the son of Abda, was also placed out-hand laws over the many thousand bondmen who worked on the roads and in the fortresses. Thus 3 high posts were newly created by Solomon. Its great extent and the riches which Solomon had amassed enabled the kingdom of Israel to hold its place amongst the greatest nations in the ancient world. Princes and nations who lived in strife with each other sought the aid of the ruler of this mighty dominion, and called upon him to act as arbitrator, for his wisdom was famed far and wide. The greatest blessing in Solomon's reign was the peace and undisturbed quiet which obtained throughout the land. From Dan unto Beersheba the Israelites could peacefully enjoy their home, everyone under his own vine and under his own fig tree. 173 The commercial agreements, the prosperity of the country, the security to life arising from the long peace maintained in Solomon's reign, all contributed to attract the surrounding tribes of Moabites, Ammonites, Idumeans, and even Egyptians to the country. It is probable, too, that the high religious culture of the Israelites, so superior to idolatry, and its splendid manifestation in the temple at Jerusalem influenced enlightened foreigners to seek shelter under the wings of the God of Israel. The country, the people, and the God of Israel acquired widespread renown in Solomon's time. The Israelitish mariners, who visited so many harbors, coastlands, and marts, and the Israelitish merchants who entered into connections with foreign parts carried reports of their fatherland to the remotest climes and nations. The praise of the wise, mighty, and brilliant King Solomon resounded far and wide in his times. In the eyes of the world he elevated the name of the God whom he honored, and to his glory he had erected a magnificent temple. The Israelitish sailors and merchants unconsciously became the first messengers and pioneers of the religion of Israel among the idolatrous nations. One day Jerusalem was surprised by an extraordinary embassy. A wise queen, from the spice-bearing land of Saudi Sheba, which is situated on the Arabian coast of the Red Sea, came to visit Jerusalem. As she had heard so much of the greatness of Solomon, and in praise of the God of Israel, she wished to see, with her own eyes, how much truth or falsehood lay in the reports which had come to her ears. She was received with marked attention by Solomon, and had many interviews with him. The queen whom tradition calls Belkis greatly admired his wisdom, and was much impressed by the temple which he had erected to God, and by the brilliancy of his court. It is said that she propounded enigmatic riddles to him in order to test his 174 powers, and these he answered in a manner which excited her astonishment. Solomon's brilliant rule, however, became the source of a serious division between the tribes, which he had unavailingly striven to consolidate into one indissoluble whole. Notwithstanding that the temple formed a bond of union for the whole people, and that Solomon tried to abolish the tribal isolation which prevailed, he succeeded only in the case of Benjamin, which became more closely united with Judah. This was owing to the fact that the temple was built on Benjamite territory, and consequently several Benjamite families settled in the capital. Probably Solomon also preferred the tribe of Benjamin and his own ancestral tribe to the other tribes. The mutual dislike of the houses of Israel and Judah, or the northern and southern tribes, had not ceased. Among the northern tribes a deep sense of discontent prevailed against Solomon, despite the prosperity to which he had raised them. They resented the pressure put upon them to forward regular supplies for the court, and to perform compulsory service in the erection of public buildings. Their discontent was not expressed aloud, but it needed only an occasion for it to vent itself. Wise as Solomon was, he had not sufficient foresight to perceive that his faults were sure to weaken the future security of the state. Amongst the officials whom Solomon employed to supervise the buildings was an Ephraimite, who was clever, courageous, and ambitious. This was Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, from the town of Zereda or Zarathan, on the other side of the Jordan. He was the son of a widow. Thus, free from eternal mistrust, he could follow his own impulses uncontrolled. Jeroboam had supervised the erection of the walls of Jerusalem, and had displayed great skill and firmness in managing the bondmen. Solomon was, in fact, so well pleased with him that he bestowed on him a high position in 175 the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. Here Jeroboam had the opportunity of becoming acquainted with the discontent of the people, which was probably strongest amongst the ever-discontented Ephraimites. The popular feeling accorded well with his ambitious plans, and he decided to utilize it when a favorable opportunity should occur. Solomon was guilty of the folly of permitting sacrificial altars to be built for various idols. It may have been his foreign wives who induced him to make this concession, or perhaps it was due to the foreigners, the Egyptians and other races, who had taken up their residence in Jerusalem, and had received permission to worship their gods in the land of Israel according to their custom. However this may have been, altars were raised on the high northern point of the Mount of Olives, in honor of Astarte of the Sidonians, Milcom of the Ammonites, Chemosh of the Moabites, and other idols. The religious convictions of the nation were not so deeply rooted that the people could witness all kinds of idolatrous practices without falling into the errors of idol worship themselves. The prophet, Ahijah of Shiloh, had the courage to reprimand the king, and to warn him of the danger which his conduct rendered imminent. Solomon, however, seems to have given little heed to his representations, and the prophet, indignant at the king's obtuseness, determined to use Jeroboam, whose ambitious schemes he had probably divined as the instrument of Solomon's destruction. When Jeroboam left Jerusalem, the prophet approached him, seized his garment, tore it into 12 pieces, and handing him 10 of them, he said, "Take these 10 pieces. They portray the 10 tribes which will separate themselves from the house of David, and recognize thee as their king." Jeroboam wanted no further encouragement to mature his plans, since the prophet had commanded 176 them. He hurried to the territories of Ephraim, and called on the Ephraimites to separate themselves from the house of David. Meanwhile Solomon had received tidings of Edom, and before the revolution could spread, he sent his guards to kill the rebel. Jeroboam then fled to Egypt, where a new dynasty now occupied the throne. Shishak-Sheshai, Sasankosis, 980-959, was the first king of the new line. Under his rule was severed the bond which had united Israel and Egypt since Solomon's marriage with the Egyptian princess. Shishak in fact was inimical to the Israelitish nation, which had become more powerful than was agreeable to him. He therefore received Jeroboam with kindness, intending to use him against Solomon. Shishak also gave a friendly reception and protection to an Edoman prince, who had special reasons for avenging himself on the Israelitish nation. Hannibal's was a relation of the Edoman king whom David had conquered. He had, when a boy, escaped the massacre ordered by Joab in consequence of a revolution in Edom. When Shishak ascended the throne, the Edoman prince hurried to Egypt, and was graciously received. Shishak gave him the queen's sister in marriage, and his firstborn son Jonadab grew up among the Egyptian princes. Had also acquired possessions in Egypt, and was honored in every way. Notwithstanding this, he yearned to return to Edom, and to regain the territories which had been snatched away from him. He carried this desire into effect with the aid of Shishak, who was fully aware that the warlike spirit which had obtained under David and Job had diminished under Solomon's peaceful rule, and that petty warfare in the mountainous districts would be connected with little danger, while it might be productive of great benefit to himself. Having the troops which he had mustered in Edom did great damage to Solomon's caravans, which carried goods between 177 the Bay of Elah and the Israelitish boundaries. And Solomon's warriors were powerless to prevent these attacks. Unnoticed by Solomon, another cloud, which threatened Israel with destruction, was gathering in the north. Rezon and Zalbah, one of the servants of King Hadadezer, whom David had overthrown, had taken to flight after the defeat of his sovereign. He assembled a predatory troop, and made raids in the districts lying between the Euphrates and the northern ranges of the Lebanon. Rezon's troops gradually increased in numbers, and with their numbers grew his courage and power. At last he ventured to proceed against the ancient city of Damascus. He succeeded in capturing it and having himself chosen king. Advancing from the north, Rezon also committed hostilities against the Israelites and their allies, without any opposition on the part of Solomon, who either had a dislike of war, or had no troops available to ward off the attacks from the north and the south. Thus arose, from small beginnings, powers inimical to Israel, which might easily have been nipped in the bud. Besides this, an internal breach was in store for Israel. Solomon, however, did not live to see the development of the impending evils and the decay of his kingdom. He died in peace at the age of about 60 years in 977. His body was buried, no doubt with great pomp, in the lofty mausoleum of the kings which David had built on the south of Mount Zion. It was said later on that Solomon, as well as his father, had heaped up untold treasures and wealth in these vaults and cells, which were discovered many centuries after by the later Jewish kings. Although Solomon had numerous wives, it appears that he left but few children, a son named Rehoboth and 2 daughters, Taphath and Basmath, whom their father married to 2 of his officers. Posterity, which has greatly exaggerated Solomon's wisdom, one's ability and ability, has also attributed to him power over mystic spirits and demons, who, obeying his will, could be invoked or dismissed as he chose. Even a ring on which his name was engraven was supposed to exercise a mighty spell over the demons, and keep them in subjection. The power to which Solomon had elevated Israel resembled that of a magic world worked by spirits. The spell was broken at his death. 179. Chapter 10 Secession of the Tribes. Accession of Rehoboam. Jeroboam's return. The king at Shechem. The secession of the 10 tribes. Election of Jeroboam. New alliances. Rezon and Shishak. Fortification of Shechem. Jeroboam's idolatry. Ahijah's rebuke. Religion in Judah. Abijah. Asa. Nadab. Baasha. Wars between Asa and Baasha. Defeat of Sarah. Ben-Hadad. Ela. Zimri. Omri. Civil war. Samaria built. Omri's policy. Alliances with Bethel and Tyre. Ahab. His character. Jezebel. The priests of Baal. Elijah. Naboth's vineyard. Elijah at Carmel. War with Ben-Hadad. Death of Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Ahaziah's succession. Joram. Elijah and Elisha. Jehu. Death of Jezebel. 977-887 BCE. For the first time since the monarchical government had been established in Israel, the next heir to the throne can succeed without disturbance or contest. Rehoboam, more fortunate than his father and grandfather, found himself, when he ascended the throne, ruler over a mighty and important country. Many nations vowed in allegiance to him, and he could indulge in golden dreams of power and happiness. His undisputed accession was perhaps owing to the fact that he had no brother, or that Solomon's strict laws regarding private property had also extended to the rights of succession. Whatever may have been the reason, Rehoboam ascended the throne of his father without opposition. In fact, disputes between brothers concerning the succession, such as had occurred at the death of David, did not occur again in Jerusalem. Nor would Rehoboam have been equal to such contests. He by no means resembled his father. Indeed, his abilities were not even mediocre. Like all princes born in the purple, who are not gifted with striking personal qualities, he was thoughtless, 180 haughty, and at the same time so wanting in self-reliance that he could not decide for himself. He had neither martial abilities nor an appreciation of greatness of any kind. The throne was to secure for him power, peace, and the enjoyment of life's pleasures. If this was his dream, it was of yet short duration. He was unexpectedly confronted with an enemy who robbed him of power and peace, and who caused a breach in the state of Israel which could never again be healed. Jeroboam, the Ephraimite who had raised the flag of rebellion during the last years of Solomon's reign, and who, on the failure of his attempt, had fled to Egypt, returned to his native land immediately on receipt of the news of Solomon's death, with the intention of resuming his ambitious schemes, which had been approved by a prophet. Probably his protector, Shishak, the king of Egypt, assisted him, and permitted him to proceed by sea to the Israelitish court. No sooner had this bold Ephraimite arrived in Shechem, the second city of importance in the kingdom, than the Shechemites, ever ready for sedition, began a revolt. Jeroboam was invited to join the meeting of the people, or rather he instigated the holding of such an assembly in order to consider the steps necessary to attain the desired end without bloodshed. The elders of other tribes were likewise invited to take part in the projects of the Shechemites, and thus their rebellious undertaking assumed the character of a national demonstration. It was first of all decided that the elders of the tribes were not, as heretofore, to repair to Jerusalem in order to pay homage to the new king, but that he was to be invited to receive their allegiance at Shechem. This was the first step in the rebellion. Rehoboam determined to accept their invitation, much against his will probably, in the expectation that his presence would put a stop to any intended insurrection. It was a disastrous 181 hour, fraught with far-reaching results for the history of Israel. Rehoboam was accompanied to Shechem by his council, consisting of the elder members who had served his father, and of younger members whom he himself had selected. In order to provide for all cases, he took with him Adoram, the overseer of the slaves, whose angry glance and whose rod kept the unwilling laborers in submission. And he arrived in Shechem, the representatives of the tribes came before him in order to explain their grievances. Jeroboam, who had been chosen as their mouthpiece, placed the troubles of the nation before the king in strong language. Thy father put a heavy yoke on the people, and made them submit to heavy burdens. If thou wilt lighten this heavy yoke, we will serve thee. Struck by this old language, Rehoboam concealed his anger as best he could, and told them to return for his reply in 3 days. He knew not what answer to give the representatives of the tribes. He therefore consulted his council. The older members were unanimously in favor of mild treatment, the younger men advocated severity, and the unwise king followed the advice of the latter. When, on the 3rd day, Jeroboam and the elders came to him for his answer, he replied in words which he thought would annihilate them. My little finger is stronger than my father's loins. If he scourge you with rods, I will scourge you with scorpions. Jeroboam had expected and reckoned on no other reply. Turning to the elders he said, What share have we in David, and what inheritance in the son of Jesse? Return to your tents, O Israel, and thou, David, see to thine own house. Jeroboam then unfurled the standard of rebellion, and assembled the Shechemites, willingly mustered around him in order to display their enmity towards Rehoboam. All the jealousy and hatred that the Ephraimites had cherished during the reigns of David and Solomon, on 182 account of the oppression and supposed humiliation to which they had been forced to submit, now burst forth. They seized the opportunity to free themselves from the yoke of David, and to place themselves, as they had done in the days of the judges, at the head of the tribes. Sword in hand, the Shechemites, headed by Jeroboam, attacked the house in which Rehoboam dwelt. He sent Adoram, the overseer of the slaves, to chastise the ringleaders like rebellious slaves. A shower of stones overpowered him, and he sank lifeless to the ground. Rehoboam, whose life was in danger, fled from Shechem in his chariot, and reached Jerusalem. A breach had been made which no one could heal. Indignant and dispirited as Rehoboam was at the turn affairs had taken in Shechem, he felt himself obliged to ascertain, before taking any steps, how far he could count on the fidelity of the nation. What was he to do, if the tribes nearest to the capital, induced by the example of the Shechemites, also renounced their allegiance to him? Where would the secession end? From this care, however, he was soon free. The tribe of Judah, which was intimately connected with the house of David, and considered that house its most precious ornament, remained faithful to Rehoboam. The tribe of Simeon was merely a subsidiary of that of Judah, and could not be considered independent. The tribe of Benjamin also remained faithful to Rehoboam. It was closely connected with that of Judah, and their fortunes did not again be parted. There were more Benjamites than Judahites living in Jerusalem. These tribes, then, sided with Rehoboam. No sooner was he aware that 2 or 3 tribes would remain true to him, than he naturally entertained the idea of compelling the Shechemites and Ephraimites to return to their allegiance by means of the sword, and he would no doubt have succeeded, had not Jeroboam taken measures to turn the secession to the greatest 183 advantage. He impressed upon the Ephraimites that only a king could successfully resist Rehoboam's attacks, and that by no other means could they escape the severe punishment which awaited them as insurgents. They then determined to set up an opposition king, who would be better suited for this post than Jeroboam. He alone possessed the needful courage and skill, and he was an Ephraimite. The elders of Ephraim therefore assembled, and with the cooperation of the remaining tribes, chose him as king. The latter paid homage to Jeroboam, possibly because they also had grievances against the house of David, and could expect no redress from Rehoboam. Thus the exterminatus of Rehoboam became over 10 tribes 977-955, counting Manasseh Machir as one, and Manasseh David as another tribe. The tribes of Judah, Benjamin and Simeon alone remained attached to the house of David. The two last named, however, had no separate existence, they were merged into the tribe of Judah. The house of Israel, which had been joined with the house of Judah for barely a century, was thus again divided from it. To avoid continual warfare as well as the necessity of being constantly on the defensive, each of the two kings sought to strengthen himself by alliances, and thus frustrate all hostile plans. Rehoboam made a treaty with the newly elected king of Damascus, a state founded by Rezon, the bandit, in Solomon's time, having attained great power. Rezon, or his successor Damascus, had united various Aramean districts to Damascus, and ruled over extensive territory. The treaty between Rehoboam and the king of Damascus prevented Jeroboam from attacking the kingdom of Judah, and visiting it with the horrors of a long war. Jeroboam, on the other hand, formed an alliance with another power, in order to exasperate and alarm the king of Judah. The union of the two kingdoms was distasteful to 184 both. The difference in their history prevented their coalescing. The house of Israel, especially the tribe of Ephraim, willingly relinquished the advantages which might accrue from a union with the house of David, in order that it might not be forced to assume an inferior position. The more worthy in both kingdoms were probably filled with grief at the breach which had occurred, but they were unable to avert it. The civil war which appeared imminent was prevented by the prophet Shemaiah, who, in the name of God, called on the Judeans and Benjamites to desist from fratricide. Slight feuds, however, broke out between the contiguous kingdoms, as was unavoidable between such near neighbors, but they led to no serious result. Jeroboam was effectually aided in his ambitious plans by Shishak, who, it is said, married his wife's eldest sister Anno to the fugitive Israelite, just as he had given another sister in marriage to the Aramean prince who had taken refuge with him. Shishak probably had furnished Jeroboam with the supplies of money that enabled him to return to his fatherland, and now the new king seems to have formed an alliance with him against Judah. Thus Rehoboam was prevented from undertaking any noteworthy steps against Israel. In order to secure himself from Egyptian and Israelitish attacks, Rehoboam erected a chain of fortresses in a circuit of several miles round about the capital. But they failed him in the hour of need. Shishak, with an overwhelming force, undertook a war against Rehoboam in the 5th year of the Jewish king's reign 972. Overcome by excessive numbers, the strongholds were taken one after another by the Egyptian armies, and Shishak pressed forward as far as Jerusalem. It appears that the capital yielded without a struggle, and the Egyptian king contented himself with seizing the treasures which Solomon had deposited in the house and the temple. He appropriated all the money 185 then in Jerusalem, as well as the golden shields and spears which the king's guards used in royal processions to the temple. He, however, left the kingdom of Judah intact, did not even touch the walls of Jerusalem, and left Rehoboam on his throne. On his return, Shishak commemorated his deeds of prowess and his victories over Judah and other districts by records and monuments. The alliance between Solomon and the king of Egypt was thus of but short duration. His son learned the futility of such a treaty, and experienced how little trust can be placed in plans and political measures, though apparently the outcome of the deepest calculation and forethought. Solomon, in spite of his wisdom, had acted obviously in regard to the union with the daughter of Pharaoh. He had built her a special palace, and within a few years after his decease, an Egyptian king ransacked this very house and other monumental buildings of Solomon, and plundered them of all their treasures. The grandeur and power of Solomon's kingdom were at an end. Jeroboam fortified Shechem and built himself a palace, which served also as a citadel armed for purposes of defense. On the opposite side of the Jordan, he also fortified various towns, among them Pembroke or Peniel, to serve as a rampart against attacks from the south, where the Moabites and the Ammonites, in consequence of what had taken place, had separated themselves from the Israelites, in the same way as the Edomites had shaken off the yoke of the Judeans. Internal embarrassments forced Jeroboam to introduce innovations. Guided either by habit or conviction, the families of the northern tribes continued to present themselves at Jerusalem in the autumn at harvest time, in order to take part in the service of the invisible God. This loyalty to the Jewish capital, being no manifested by only a part of his subjects, was a source of great anxiety to Jeroboam. How would it be if the people turned in ever one increasing numbers to the temple in Jerusalem, and once more made peace with the house of David? Would he not be dethroned as quickly as he had attained to royalty? In order to avoid the possibility of such a reunion, Jeroboam matured the wicked plan, which caused Israel to fall back into the ways of idolatry and barbarity. During his protracted stay in Egypt, Jeroboam had become acquainted with the system of worship established there, and he had observed that the worship of animals, particularly of the bull, tended to promote the aims of despotic government. He had observed that this animal worship served to stultify the nation, and Jeroboam thought he might turn to his own purposes of systems so politic and advantageous. He therefore, in conjunction with his advisors, devised a plan by which these observances should be introduced in the 10 tribes. He considered that this idol worship might be of advantage to him in other ways, as it would keep him in favor with the court of Egypt. Israel would appear as a dependency of Egypt, and both countries, having common religious observances and customs, would also have common interests. The habits of Egypt were of special interest to him, and his wife was probably an Egyptian, and connected with the royal house of Egypt. Jeroboam also studied the convenience of the tribes. He wished to relieve those who lived far off from the necessity of making long journeys at the time of the harvest. At Bethel and at Dan, Jeroboam, therefore, put up golden calves, and issued a proclamation to the effect, "This is thy God, O Israel, who brought thee out of Egypt." In Bethel, where he himself intended to preside at the worship, he built a large temple, in which he also placed a sacrificial altar. To prevent the people from celebrating the feast and gathering at Jerusalem, he fixed the festival a month later in the 8th instead of the 7th month. Probably also a different time reckoning was followed, 187 according to the longer solar, instead of the shorter lunar year. The nation, as a whole, appears to have taken no offense at this alteration, but to have actually regarded it as a revival of the ancient mode of worship. The fundamental principle, the unity of God, was in no way affected by it. Jeroboam had not attempted to introduce polytheism, but had merely given an incarnation of the deity, symbolizing strength and fruitfulness. The people, naturally sensual, were, indeed, well pleased to have a representation of the Godhead. The spirituality of God, not admitting of ocular demonstration, was at that period more remote from their comprehension than the conception of his unity. Sensual dissipation and depravity were not bound up with the worship of the bull as with the Canaanite service of Baal, and therefore it did not outrage the moral sense. Thus the people gradually became accustomed to repair to Bethel and for the high priests. Otherwise they made their offerings at home, or at the nearest place where sacrifices had been offered of old. Jeroboam fully attained his object. The nation became stultified, and bowed to him in servile obedience. The tribe of Levi, however, caused him anxiety. No Levite would consent to perform the office of priest at the worship of the bull. For Samuel's prophetic teachings had made a lasting impression on this tribe. That Jeroboam might not compel their services, the Levites, who had been living in the Israelitish towns, wandered forth, and settled in the kingdom of Judah. As he could not possibly manage without priests, he took anyone who offered himself to serve in that capacity. At one festival he himself performed the priestly office, in order to elevate the united people, or, perhaps, in imitation of the Egyptian custom. Jeroboam was thus led step by step to destroy the original principles of Judaism. His conduct was not allowed to pass uncondemned. 188 The old prophet, Ahijah, of Shiloh, who had incited Nebat's ambitious unto insurrection, now was too old and frail to lift his voice publicly against these proceedings. When, however, Jeroboam's wife visited him at Shiloh, to consult him about the dangerous illness of her eldest son, the prophet took the opportunity of announcing to her the approaching dissolution of their royal house. But a return was impossible, without paving the way to a reunion with the house of David. From motives of self-preservation, he was obliged to continue in the way he had chosen. The new worship was, therefore, retained during the existence of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and none of Jeroboam's successors attempted to make any alteration in its form. In the kingdom of Judah or house of Jacob, the conditions were quite different. Politically weakened by the severance of the tribes and the incursions of Egypt and Shishak, its wounds were too deep to heal before the lapse of a considerable time. Neither Judah had not sunk in religion or morals. Rehoboam appears to have troubled himself but little about religious or moral affairs. He was indifferent in every respect, and his pride having once received a blow, he seems to have passed his days in idleness. But the temple, on the one hand, and the Levites, on the other, appear to have counteracted all deteriorating influences. In outward appearance all remained as it had been in the time of Solomon. The high altars banner, on which families performed the sacrificial rites throughout the year, continued to be maintained, but periodically festivals the people repaired to the temple. Deviations from the established order of divine service were exceptional, and were accepted only by the Soviet babies. As Solomon had permitted altars to be erected for his heathen wives, Rehoboam did not feel called upon to be more severe in his enactments. His mother Baasha, the daughter or granddaughter of Absalom, had a predilection for 189 the immoral Canaanite worship. She erected a statue of Astarte in her palace, and maintained temple priestesses. Rehoboam permitted all this, but the unholy innovations did not spread very wide. Meanwhile, although idolatrous practices did not gain ground in the kingdom of Judah, there was no impulse towards a higher stage of moral culture under Rehoboam's government. A weakness seemed to have come over the people, as if they were in the last stage of senility. Nearly 2 centuries elapsed before traces of a higher spiritual force became evident. Rehoboam's reign of 17 years was inglorious. The reign of his son Abijah 960-958 passed in a like manner. He also indulged in petty acts of hostility against Jeroboam, but without any important result. He, too, committed the idolatrous practices of his mother Baasha. Abijah, it appears, died young, leaving no issue, and he was therefore succeeded by his brother Asa 957-918. He then was a minor, and Queen Mother Baasha held reins of government. At first she seems to have desired to extend her idolatrous and immoral worship, but a revolution in the kingdom of the 10 tribes put an end to her projects, and changed the course of events. Nadab, who had succeeded to the throne on the death of Jeroboam 955-954, undertook a war against the Philistines, and besieged the great city of Jebethar, which the Philistines had occupied. During this campaign a soldier by the name of Baasha conspired against the king of Camp, and killed him. From the camp Baasha proceeded to the capital, Tirzah, and destroyed the whole house of Jeroboam 954. The founder of this dynasty had not been anointed by the prophet. He was not considered inviolable, like Saul and David, and therefore the hand of the murderer was not restrained. Baasha was the first of the list of regicides in the 10 tribes, and his act hastened the fate impending over the nation. One night having perpetrated the murder, he took possession of the throne in Kingdom 954-933. He continued Tirzah as the capital, on account of its central position. It lay in the very heart of the kingdom, and possessed the additional advantage of being fortified. When Baasha abolished the worship of the bull, he might have drawn to his side the worthier portion of the people of Judah. The latter were indignant at the idolatrous innovations of Baasha, which were more reprehensible than the bull worship, as with them were connected the depraved habits of the temple priestesses. In Jerusalem the fear of eventual sympathy with Israel appears to have risen. But Asa hastened to avert the calamity. Either on his own impulse, or urged thereto by one of the prophets, he snatched the reins of government from the hands of the Queen Mother, forbade the worship of Astarte, removed the priestesses, and burned the disgusting image which had been erected, or worship in the Bedroom. Through these resolute acts Asa secured for himself the good will of the well-disposed among his people. The old inconclusive feuds between the two kingdoms were continued between Asa and Baasha. The former is said to have acquired several cities and to have incorporated them in his own kingdom. In order to secure himself from the attacks of Judah, Baasha seems to have entered into a league with the king of Egypt, and to have urged him to carry war into the lands of his own foe. An Egyptian general named Zerah Ozurkan sallied forth with a numerous body of Ethiopians, and pressed forwards as far as Mareshah, about 10 leagues southwest of Jerusalem. Asa, however, marched against him with the combined forces of Judah and Benjamin, defeated the Ethiopian army north of Mareshah, pursued it as far as Jerub, and brought back enormous booty to Jerusalem. Baasha was disconcerted by these proceedings, 191 and endeavored to bring about an alliance with the Aramean king, Ben-Hadad, of Damascus, who, hitherto friendly to the kingdom of Judah, had prevented all political attacks. Ben-Hadad, the son of Tigran, now cancelled his treaty with Asa, and went over to Baasha's side. The latter conquered Ramah, the birthplace and residence of the prophet Samuel, which belonged to the Benjamites, and fortified it so that it served as a base whence to make raids on the neighboring districts. Alarmed at these doings, Asa endeavored to revive the treaty with the king of Damascus, and sent ambassadors to him, with quantities of treasure in silver and gold, which he took both from the temple and from his houses. Ben-Hadad allowed himself to be won over. It flattered him to be thus sought after by both realms, to which his people had formerly been obliged to pay tribute. He resolved to utilize the weakness of both sides, and he commanded an army to effect an entrance into the north of the kingdom of Israel. He subjugated Again, Dan, and the contiguous region of Abel Beth and also reduced the district around the lake of Tiberias, and the mountainous lands of the tribe of Naphtali. Asa was thus saved at the expense of Judah's sister nation. And Baasha was forced to abandon his desire for conquest, and to relinquish Ramah. Asa now summoned all the men capable of bearing arms to assist in the destruction of the fortifications of Ramah. The death of Baasha, which occurred soon after this in 933, and a revolution which ensued in Tirzah, left Asa free from menace on that side. Mizpah, a town having a very high and favorable situation, was made an important citadel by Asa. He also built a deep and roomy cistern in the rocks, in order to have stores of water in case of a siege. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of the 10 tribes, terrible events were happening, which were productive of changes in both kingdoms. Baasha was succeeded 192 by his son Ela 933-932, who was addicted to idleness and drunkenness. Whilst his warriors were engaged in battle with the Philistines, and were attacking Gibbethon, he passed his days in drinking bouts. This circumstance was taken advantage of by his servant Simri Zimri, the commander of one half of the war chariots, which had remained behind in Tirzah. Whilst Ela was dissipating in the house of the captain of his palace, Zimri killed him in 932, at the same time destroying the entire house of Baasha, and not even sparing its friends. He then, as a matter of course, ascended the throne, but his reign was of short duration. It lasted only 1 week. No sooner had the news of the king's murder reached the army, then besieging Gibbethon, than they elected the Israelitish general Omri as king. He repaired to the capital, but finding the gates closed against him, he laid siege to the city and effected a breach in the wall. When Zimri discovered that he was lost, he anticipated the disgraceful end by setting fire to the palace and perishing in the flames. He was the third of 5 kings of Israel who died an unnatural death, and only 2 of them were buried in the mausoleum of the kings, erected by Jeroboam. A 4th king was soon to be added to the list. Omri, a warrior, expected to obtain the vacant throne forthwith, but he met with opposition. One part of the population of the capital had chosen another king, Tibni, the son of Janah. He was probably a native of the city. Thus 2 parties were formed in the capital, and the streets were no doubt deluged with blood. A civil war was the one thing wanting in the domains of Ephraim to make the measure of misery full to overflowing. For 3 years the partisan conflict raged in 932-928. At length the party of Omri gained the upper hand. Tibni was killed, and Omri remained sole ruler 928. He, however, felt ill at ease in Tirzah. Household matches since the death of Zimri, and other depredations had no doubt taken place during the protracted civil war 193. The conquered party was hostile to him, and Omri, therefore, determined to transfer the seat of the empire. He could not select Shechem, where the restless and rebellious spirits of the inhabitants would not permit him to live in safety, and there was no other important town situated in the heart of the country. Omri therefore conceived the idea of building a new capital. A high plateau, at a few hours distance northwest of Shechem, seemed to him the fittest spot. He bought it of its owner, Shemer, erected buildings, a palace and other houses, fortified it, and called it Shamar on Samaria. Whence did he obtain inhabitants for the newly founded city? He probably adopted a course similar to David's in the case of Jerusalem, and caused the warriors attached to his cause to settle there. A year after his victory over the rival king, Omri left Tirzah, and removed to Samaria, which was destined to be the rival of Jerusalem for a period of 200 years, and then, after 2 centuries of desertion, to revive, and once more wage war against Judah and Jerusalem. Samaria inherited the hatred of Shechem against Jerusalem, and increased it tenfold. The new city gave its name to the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and the land was thence called the land of Samaria. Omri, the first king of Samaria, was neither strong nor a warlike leader, but he was a wise man. The crown which he had acquired, rather by the favor of circumstances than his own force of will, did not satisfy him. He wished to make his court and his people great, respected and wealthy, and he hoped that the prosperity of the days of Solomon might be restored to Israel. It is true that the nation was divided, and thereby weakened. But was it necessary for war always to be carried on between the 2 portions, and for the sword to destroy them? Connected as they were by reason of tribal relations and common interests, could they not henceforth pursue their course in friendly alliance? 194 Omri endeavored, in the first place, to make peace with the representative of the royal house of David, and to impress upon him the advantages, to both of them, of pursuing an amicable policy. They might in that way obtain their former sway over the countries which had once been tributary to them. For a long time friendly relations were actually established between the 2 kingdoms, and they supported, instead of opposing, each other. Omri also cherished to a great, perhaps even to a too great degree, the hope of a friendly alliance with Pietishah. He desired that a part of the riches which their extensive maritime expeditions and trade introduced into that country, might also flow into his own kingdom. At this time various kings had waded to the throne entire through the blood of their predecessors, until at length Anthalithurl, who still started, ascended the throne, after the murder of his predecessor, Phares. The disastrous occurrences in Pietishah had quickly weakened the land. The great families had been compelled to emigrate, and had founded colonies on the north coast of Africa. The kingdom of Damascus, which had acquired great power, sought to obtain possession of the productive coastline of Pietishah. Ethwal, therefore, had to strengthen himself by means of alliances. The kingdom of the 10 tribes was nearest to him. Omri and Ethwal therefore had common interests, and formed an offensive and defensive treaty. The league, desired by both powers, was confirmed by an intermarriage. Omri's son Ahab married Ethbal's daughter Jezebel, or rival marriage which was fraught with disastrous consequences. Omri, fortified by this alliance, could now venture to think of undertaking warlike expeditions. He captured several towns of Moab, which had emancipated itself under Jeroboam's rule, and compelled it to become once more tributary. He forced the Moabites to send herds of oxen and rams every year 195 as tribute. As, however, a sort of alliance existed between Moab and Aram, and an increase of Israel's power was watched by Aram of Jelisai, the Aramean king of Damascus, Ben-Hadad, declared war against Omri, and recovered some of the cities he had taken. Omri was forced to accept peace with Ben-Hadad on hard terms, and bound himself to open the caravan roads through the kingdom of Israel, and to allow free passage through the land. Omri thereupon entered into a closer alliance with the kingdom of Tyre, and pursued the plan of assimilating his people to their Canaanite neighbors. Why should he endeavor to keep Israel separate from the surrounding peoples? Would it not be wiser and better to permit the kingdom of the 10 tribes to assume a Pietitian or Tyrian character? United as they were in language and customs, might not the two races become more closely welded together if the Egyptian form of worship were introduced into the kingdom of Israel? Omri led the way to this union. He introduced the service of Baal and Astarte as the official mode of worship. He built a temple for Baal in his capital of Samaria, ordained priests, and commanded that sacrifices should be universally made to the Egyptian idols. He desired to see the worship of the bull, as observed in Bethel and Dan, abolished. It seemed to him too distinctly Israelitish in character, and to be likely to maintain the division between the Israelites and the Egyptians. Jehovah, adored with war without a visible image, was too striking a contrast to the Tyrian follower Adonis for Omri to permit his worship to remain. Omri's innovations were of far greater import than those of Jeroboam. Or, to speak in the language of the Bible, he acted yet more sinfully than his predecessors. He desired to rob the nation of its God and of its origin. He desired it to forget that it had a special nationality in contradistinction to that of the idolaters. History 196 does not record how these changes were received. His son Ahab 922-901 was destined to continue the work, his father's request, as it were. In furtherance of the latter's projects, he naturally kept up a close connection with Tyre and with the king of Judah. But the execution of the charge involving the severest attacks on the inner conviction of man is, in spite of all one may do, dependent on circumstances or contingencies beyond the calculations of the wisest mind. Two kinds of obstacles intervened to prevent the colonization of the 10 tribes. The one was Ahab's disposition, and the other arose from an unexpected cause which weakened, if it did not entirely destroy, the effect of the terrible blow aimed at religion. In order to accomplish this transformation of the nation into a mere appendage of Pietishah, and the consequent loss of its own identity, the successor of Omri needed a powerful mind, an unbending will, and unyielding severity to crush all opposition with a strong hand. Ahab was, however, of an entirely different nature, mild, love in peace and comfort, rather disposed to avoid disturbances and obstacles than to seek or remove them. Had it rested with him alone, he would have abandoned his father's system and given himself up to such enjoyments as the royal power granted him, regardless of what the future might bring. Ahab was not even warlike. He permitted the neighboring kings to treat him in a manner which would have excited the indignation and roused the most determined opposition of any king not altogether destitute of the feeling of honor. But as he was forced against his desire and inclination to enter into a contest with an ambitious neighbor, so he was also compelled to enter upon a conflict with the Israelitish nation. His father had given him a wife in every way his opposite, with a strong manly will, who was determined to gain her insight, severity, and cruelty, if necessary. 197 Jezebel, the Egyptian princess, whose father had filled the post of priest to Astarte before he obtained the throne, was filled with enthusiastic eagerness to carry out the plan of canonizing the people of Israel. Either from a perverted idea or from political considerations, she desired to amalgamate the Israelitish people with her own, and make Tyrians and Israelites one nation. She continued the work commenced by Omri, with energy and mercilessness, and led her weak-minded husband into all kinds of oppressive and unrighteous actions. Jezebel's gloomy and obstinate character, with her uncontrollable energy, was the cause of the ferment and commotion of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, which led to disastrous results, of which, like a destroying storm, performed the beneficent service of clearing the atmosphere. Jezebel's first step was to build a great temple to Baal in the capital of Samaria. In such a temple there were 3 altars, images and pillars, which were dedicated to a sort of holy trinity, Baal, whose consort Astarte, and the god of fire or destruction was Rakchan. For this worship, Jezebel introduced into the country a host of priests and prophets, 450 for Baal and 400 for Astarte, who were supported at the expense of the royal house, and dined at the queen's table. Some of these priests attended to the sacrifices in Samaria, while others rushed madly through the country, celebrating their scandalous rites in the cities and villages. The Egyptian priests or prophets attired themselves in women's apparel, painted their faces and eyes, as women were in the habit of doing, their arms bared to the shoulders, and carried swords and axes, scourges, castanets, pipes, cymbals and drums. Dancing and wailing, they rolled around in a circle, by turns bowed their heads to the ground, and dragged their hair through the mud. They also did their arms and cut their bodies with swords and knives till the blood ran, providing an offering for their bloodthirsty 198 goddess. Doubtless they were accompanied by temple priestesses Kibesra, who followed their shameful pursuit in honor of Astarte, and for the benefit of the priests. By means of this troop of priests and following the ecstatic followers of Astarte, Jezebel hoped to wean the Israelitish people from the God of its fathers, and to carry into effect by entirely transforming the national character. At the head of the Egyptian priesthood there was a high priest, who probably gave instructions and commands as to how they were to proceed. In the first place, the altars dedicated to God were destroyed, and others erected in the Canaanite fashion, with stone pillars, the symbols of an obscene cult. The altars in Bethel and Dan were, no doubt, transformed in a similar manner. It was intended that the sacrifice-loving nation, for want of altars of its own, should bring its offerings to the temples of Baal and of Astarte, and thus become accustomed to this mode of worship. How easy it is to force a nation to give up its usages and peculiarities, and to accept those of strangers, if the rulers act with subtlety and force combined. The Israelites in the kingdom of the 10 tribes had already been demoralized, owing to their half-century's separation from Jerusalem, the center of intellectual activity, and to the bull worship which they had long been practicing. The cities had acquired a taste for luxury, and a love of dissipation, which the impure worship of Baal and Astarte only served to fluster. The towns doubtless, for the most part, yielded to the new state of things, or, in any case, offered no opposition to it. 7,000 individuals alone remained firm, and would not pay homage to Baal, nor adore him with their lips. A part of the nation, amongst them the villagers, meanwhile wavered in their ideas and actions, and not knowing whether God or Baal was the mightier divinity, they worshipped the one publicly and the other secretly. It was a period of uncertainty 199 and confusion, such as usually precedes a historical crisis. It remained to be seen whether the ancients believed in the God of Israel, and the demands of holiness had taken sufficiently deep root, and had acquired enough vitality and power to conquer an opposing force and eradicate what was foreign. In such times a man of striking personality, in whom lives a pure faith, and who is entirely ruled by it, naturally assumes leadership, and by firmness, enthusiasm and heroic self-sacrifice convinces the waverers, strengthens the weak, incites the indifferent, and thus collects an army of defenders to rescue from imminent destruction their own national, peculiar endowments. When such an individual is roused by the very opposition of the enemy, and spurred on to action, he becomes a vivifying principle, and brings about a new state of things, a mingling of both old and new elements. Such an individual arose during this crisis in the person of the prophet Elijah 920-900. Whence came this energetic, also doing prophet? In which tribe was his cradle? Who was his father? This is not known. He was simply known as Ojo, who shortened into Elijah. He was not a citizen of Transhur Al-Khalid, but belonged to that class of tolerant half-citizens called Tashdum dwellers. He was of a tempestuous nature, and was guided by no considerations of expediency. He would not have hesitated to offer his life for his creed. He was considered by his successor as the incarnation of moral and religious Elkanah. Like a tempest he made his entry, like a tempest he thundered forth his execrations against the weak, woman-led Ahab. Like a tempest he rushed away, so that no one could seize him. And in a tempest he finally disappeared from his earthly scene of action. Elijah was imbued with the one thought, to save the belief in the God of Israel, which was passing away from the minds of the people. To this God he dedicated himself, 200 into his service did his life belong solely and exclusively. Elijah was outwardly distinguishable by his peculiar dress. In contradistinction to the effeminate, luxurious dress of the worshippers of Baal and Astartes, his undergarment was confined by a leather belt, and over it he wore a black hairy cloak. He wore his hair long, and touched no wine, and thus gave rise to the institution of Nazarites, who were not permitted to drink wine or to shave the hair of the head. In this costume and with these habits he appeared first in Gilead, and there announced the all-embracing creed, Jehovah alone is God. Here, where the Jordan offered a barrier against the swarms of the priests of Baal, and where the fear of Ahab and Jezebel could not paralyze the conscience, there were yet faithful adherents of the God of Israel. Amongst these Elijah probably found his first auditors and disciples, who were carried away by his enthusiastic manner, and became his couplers. In a short time a body of prophets or disciples men and had arisen, who were ready to give up their lives for their ancestral tenets. They also followed Elijah's way of living, and became Nazarites. The principles of this newly formed circle were to lead a simple life, not to dwell in cities where luxury and effeminacy ruled, but in village tents, not to drink wine, not to till vineyards, to avoid agriculture generally, but, like the patriarchs and the tribes in earlier times, to live by tending flocks. Jonadab, the son of Rechab, who doubtless was one of the followers of Elijah, was the first to establish these rules for himself and his household. He impressed on his descendants the necessity of abstaining from wine, from building fixed residences, from sowing seed, and especially from planting vineyards. In this way Elijah not only aroused and inspired a band of defenders of the ancient law for his own time, but opened the path to a new future. He set simplicity and self-restraint against the jealousy and tier one love of pleasure. With his body of disciples he eagerly commenced action against the priests and prophets of Baal. He probably passed rapidly from place to place, called the populace together, and inspired them with his scorn-like eloquence, the point of which was Jehovah alone is God, and Baal and Astartes are dumb, lifeless idols. He may even have incited attacks on those priests of Baal whom he encountered. Jezebel could not long endure the doings of the energetic Tishbite, which interfered with her plans. She sent her soldiers against Elijah's troop, and those who fell into their hands were mercilessly slaughtered. They were the first martyrs who died for a Jewish ancient law. Jezebel, the daughter of Edwal, the priest of Astartes, was the first persecutor for religion's sake. Elijah himself, however, on whom Jezebel was specially anxious to wreak her vengeance, could never be reached, but always eluded his pursuers. His zeal had already produced an important effect. Obadiah, the superintendent of Ahab's palace, was secretly attached to the ancient law. He who, perhaps, had the task of persecuting the disciples of the prophet, hid 100 of them in 2 caves of Mount Carmel, 50 in each cave, and supplied them with bread and water. Obadiah was not alone. He had his employment of his own faith, who executed his secret commissions. How could Jezebel combat an invisible enemy that found assistance in her own house? One day, Elijah, though defied of his followers, ventured into the vicinity of King Ahab, whose weak, prideful disposition he knew, in order to approach him for the misdeeds which he committed. Ahab was passionate for building and fortifying towns. It was at his instance that Jericho, which had been defied of its walls since the entry of the Israelites, was fortified by Hill of Bethel. Ahab also founded a new capital in the beautiful tableland of Jezreel, where he was desirous of passing the winter months, for 202 Samaria served only summer residents. This new town of Jezreel, which was destined to become the scene of passion and conquest, was built with great splendor. The royal couple had a palace of ivory red to bear, which was to be surrounded by extensive gardens. For this purpose Ahab wished to have a beautiful vineyard which belonged to Naboth, one of the most respected citizens of Israel. Ahab offered him a compensation, either in money or land, but Naboth did not wish to part with the heritage of his fathers. Disappointed at his inability to surround his palace with card-like grounds, Ahab would not even take food. Finding him in this state, Jezebel contemptuously upbraided him for his childish vexation and his cowardly helplessness, but promised him that he should nevertheless possess the desired vineyard. She sent down letters of kings naming those of the elders of Israel of whose age shall be eventually certain, and commanded them to produce 2 witnesses who would testify to having heard Naboth revile the gods and Israel. When the council of judges had assembled at one of the gates of Jezreel, and Naboth, who was the eldest among them, had placed himself at their head, 2 degraded men appeared, and testified against Naboth, under oath, as they had been instructed. Naboth was condemned to death by the elders, and the sentence was carried out not only on him, but also on his sons. The property of the executed fell by Elijah the king. Jezebel triumphantly announced to her husband, "Now take Naboth's vineyard, for he is dead." When Elijah heard of this crime, he could no longer contain himself. He repaired to Jezreel and met the king just as he was inspecting Naboth's vineyard. Behind him rode 2 men, of whom one was fated to become the avenger of Naboth. The prophet thundered out to him, "Hast thou murdered, and dost now take possession? In the place where dogs lick the blood of Naboth, shall dogs lick thy blood, you none." 203 Kings XXI. 19. C2 Kings X. 25. This denunciation had an overwhelming effect on Ahab. He reflected in meekly dependence, but ruthless Jezebel's power over her weak-minded husband was too strong for this change of mind to last. Elijah, who had suddenly disappeared, now returned a second time to Ahab, and announced that the famine of several years' duration would befall the land. He then departed and dwelt in the Egyptian town of Zarephath-Sarepta, and the house of the widow, and later in the cave of Mount Carmel. Meanwhile a famine devastated the land, and there was not fodder even for the king's horses. One day, Elijah approached Obadiah, the superintendent of the palace, and said to him, "Go, tell thy master, Elijah is here." On his entrance, Ahab said to him, "Is it thou, disturber of Israel?" Then the prophet replied, "Not I have troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house have." As though he had the right to give orders, he bade the king and the priests of Baal to assemble on Mount Carmel, where it would be revealed who was the true, and who the false prophet. What occurred on Mount Carmel, where the contest took place, must have produced an extraordinary impression. Ahab, we are told, summoned all the prophets of Baal to the mountain, although many of the people prepared, anxious to witness the result of the contest between the prophets and the king, and to see whether the prevailing drought would in consequence come to an end. The 100 prophets who had been in the caves of Carmel, and were maintained there by Obadiah, were probably also present. Elijah presided at the assembly, which he addressed, saying 1 Kings XVII. 21. How long halt you between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. He then ordered the priests of Baal to erect an altar, offer sacrifices, and call on their God for a miracle. The 204 priests did so, and according to their custom, they wounded themselves with knives and lances till the blood gushed forth over their bodies. They cried from morning till midday, O Baal, hear us. When they at length ceased in confusion, Elijah erected an altar of 12 stones, performed his sacrifice, and prayed in a low voice. Then a miracle followed so suddenly that all present fell on their faces and cried, Jehovah alone is God. A flash of lightning burned the sacrifice and everything on the altar, even the water in the trench was dried up. Elijah determined to avenge himself on the priests of Baal, and commanded the multitude to kill them and throw their bodies into the river Kishon, which flowed hard by. Ahab, who was present, was so amazed and terror-stricken that he permitted this act of violence. Jezebel, however, who was made of stern herself, did not look with equal unconcern on this scene. On receiving information of what had occurred, she threatened Elijah with a similar fate, if he should ever fall into her hands. He was, therefore, obliged to flee in order to save himself. In the desert near Mount Horeb he had a vision, in which it was revealed to him that the kingdom would pass away from the house of Ahab, whose descendants would be utterly destroyed, and that Jehu was to be anointed as king over Israel. Elijah himself was instructed to return on his way to the wilderness of Damascus, appoint a successor, and retire from the scene of action. The intemperate zeal which had led him to direct the slaughter of the priests of Baal was severely condemned on Horeb. During Elijah's long absence there appears to have been a sort of truce between the royal house of Omri and the followers of the Tishbite. Ahab, who had been an eyewitness of the events at Carmel, had probably become more indifferent towards the worship of Baal, and as far as lay in his power had put a stop to the persecution of the prophets of the Lord. 205 the latter, on their part, also seemed to have become less aggressive. Associations of prophets were formed in Jericho, Bethel and Gilgal, in which places they were permitted to dwell unmolested. One prophet or disciple, however, remained inimical to Ahab, Amy, Caleb, son of Eli. As often as the king sought out Virginia to learn his prospects of success in some enterprise, the prophet foretold evil. Ahab, however, did not attempt his life, but merely imprisoned him. The ruler of the kingdom of the 10 tribes had misfortunes enough to serve him as forewarnings. The king of Aram, Ben-Hadad II, became daily more powerful, more presuming, and more eager for conquest. Besides his own horsemen and chariots, he had in his train 32 conquered vassal kings. Without business he attacked Ahab August, although profiting by famine and discord which were weakening his kingdom. Ben-Hadad subdued entire districts of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and besieged Samaria in 94. In his distress, Ahab sued for peace, but Ben had imposed such hard and disgraceful conditions that Ahab was forced to continue the contest. Finally, Ahab was victorious, and the Aramean king, forced to surrender, was ready to promise anything in order to secure peace. The former enemies became friends, made a treaty and ratified it by many oaths, soon to be forgotten. This hastily formed alliance was rightly condemned by one of the prophets, who predicted that Ahab had thereby created a fresh source of danger. Ben-Hadad, in fact, had no desire to fulfill the conditions and promises of the treaty. Here is word, it is true, the captured town of Naphtali, but the Transjordanic Jews, especially the important town of Ramoth Gilead, he refused to see, and Ahab was too indifferent to press the matter. The longer he delayed, the more difficult it became for him to insist on his claim, as their man meanwhile was recovering 206 his strength. Perhaps it would have been impossible for Ahab alone to regain possession of Ramoth Gilead by force of arms. Just at this time he formed an alliance with King Jehoshaphat of Judah 918-905, and together with this king, he ventured to proceed against Ben-Hadad. This alliance was a surprising one, seeing that Jehoshaphat detested the idolatrous perversions of Ahab and Jezebel, and could not approve of the forcible introduction of the Baal worship into Samaria, nor of the cruel persecution of the prophets. Nevertheless, he formed an intimate connection with the house of Omri, and, guided by political reasons, even permitted his son Joram to marry Athaliah, the idolatrous daughter of Ahab. When Jehoshaphat paid his visit to Samaria, in order to strengthen himself by an alliance with its king, Ahab probably solicited his royal guests to aid him in recovering Ramoth Gilead. And the king of Judah promised the help of his nation and soldiery. Thus, after a long separation, the kings of Israel and Judah fought side by side. After crossing the Jordan with Jehoshaphat, Ahab was mortally wounded by an arrow as he stood in his war chariot, but he possessed sufficient presence of mind to order his charioteer to drive him out of the turmoil of the battle. The soldiers were not informed of the king's condition, and fought until evening. Not until after the king had bled to death did the herald announce that each returned to his own country and to his own town. The Israeli Shemsharen armies then recrossed the Jordan, and the Arameans remained in possession of the mountain city of Ramoth Gilead. Ahab's corpse was brought to Samaria and interred. But his blood, which had filled the chariot, was washed out at a pool and licked up by dogs. Ahaziah, his son, succeeded him, this being the first occasion on which the kingdom of the 10 tribes descended in a direct line to a grandson. He reigned in a short time 901-900, and but little is 207 known of his character. In spite of all warnings, he followed in the evil ways of his parents. Falling from the window of his room, he took to bed, and sent Migron to consult the oracle of the reputed idol Baal of Belzebul. By this time Elijah had returned from his sojourn on Mount Horeb, but in accordance with the commands laid upon him, he had remained in seclusion, probably on Mount Carmel. He no longer interfered with the course of events, but had chosen as his successor Elisha, son of Shaphat, who lived near the Jordan. The manner of choice was characteristic of Elijah. While Elisha was plowing a field with a yoke of oxen, Elijah approached, threw over him his dusty mantle, the distinctive garb of the prophets, and went away. If Elisha was indeed worthy to succeed him, he would understand the sign. Elisha ran after him and intended to wait until he had taken leave of his parents. Go. Return, said Elijah curtly. Elisha understood that a faithful prophet of God must leave father and mother, and sacrifice the wishes of his heart and the habits of his life. Without returning to his father's house, he followed Elijah at once, and became his attendant, or, in the language of the time, poured water on his hands. Only once again did Elijah take part in public affairs. He accosted the messenger whom Ahaziah had had sent to Beelzebub, and said to him, Great Lord, he who sent thee, is there no God in Israel, that thou sendest reverend in order to consult Beelzebub concerning thine illness? The messenger returned to Samaria and related what he had heard of the extraordinary man. From the description Ahaziah recognized Elijah, and dispatched messengers for him. After a long delay, Elijah went fearlessly to Samaria, and announced to Ahaziah that he would not again leave his sick bed. As the king died without leaving any children, he was succeeded by his brother Joram, 899-887. Elijah also disappeared from the scene at about the same time. 208 his disciples and followers could not believe that the mortal frame of so fiery as soul could crumble into dust, and the belief arose that he had ascended to heaven in a storm line. His constant follower, Elisha, seeing that his master desired to avoid him, followed him more closely. Elijah visited Gilgal, Bethel and Jericho, followed by Elisha, who did not venture to ask him whither he was going. At length they crossed the Jordan on dry ground, and then the teacher was withdrawn from his disciples' vision in a fiery chariot with fiery horses, which conveyed the prophet to heaven. The untiring activity of Elijah in preserving the ancient law under the most unfavorable circumstances, amid ceaseless strife and persecution, surrounded by the idolatry and wickedness of the Baal and Astarte worship, could only be explained as the result of miracles. The greatest marvel, however, which Elijah accomplished, consisted in founding a circle of disciples who succeeded in keeping alive the teachings of the ancient law, and who raised their voices against the perversions of the mighty ones of the land. The members of the prophetic school founded by the prophet lived by the work of their own hands. After Elijah's disappearance, the disciples being without a leader, Elisha placed himself at their head. In the beginning of his career he followed closely in the footsteps of his master, keeping aloof from all men, and living chiefly on Mount Carmel. Gradually, however, he accustomed himself to mix with the people, especially after he had succeeded in rousing an energetic man to destroy the house of Omri, and put an end to the worship of Baal. Joram, the third of the Omris, was not as fanatical in his desire to spread idolatry as his mother Jezebel, but nevertheless Elisha felt so profound an aversion for him that he could not bear to meet him face to face. After his brother's death, Joram moved to war against King Mesa-Mesha in order to punish him for his deception, and to reduce him to 209 subjection. Together with his brother-in-law, Jehoshaphat, he determined to proceed through Idumea, whose king was also to supply auxiliary forces, and south of the Dead Sea, towards Moab. By taking this route Joram passed to Jerusalem, where the heads of the houses of Israel and Jacob met in a friendly way. But it was merely an alliance of the chiefs. By the advice of Jehoshaphat, Elisha, as the successor of Elijah, was summoned to foretell the issue of the war. On seeing Joram, the prophet said to him, Were it not out of consideration for King Jehoshaphat, I would not look at thee. Go bow to the prophets of thy father and thy mother. He nevertheless prophesied a favorable result. Mesa, king of Moab, who was awaiting the attack of the allies on the southern border of his kingdom, was overcome by force of numbers, and fled to the mountain fortress of Kir-Hareseth Moab, Kerith. The land of Moab was laid waste, although Mesa was not subjugated. Not long after, on the death of Jehoshaphat, Edom also fell away from Judah. Edom had not acted quite fairly in the combined attack on Moab, and appears to have come to a friendly understanding with Mesa after the withdrawal of the allies. It seemed as if the close friendship and intermarriage with the house of Omri was destined to bring nothing but misfortune on the house of David. Joram, the son of Jehoshaphat, the namesake of his royal brother-in-law of Israel 894-888, was so intimately connected with the royal house of Israel that he introduced idolatrous practices into his own country. There can be no question but that his wife Athaliah was the cause of this, for she, like her mother Jezebel, was fanatically attached to the disgraceful rites connected with the worship of Baal. At length the fate impending over the house of Omri was to be fulfilled, and the house of David was destined to be entangled in its meshes, woven by Elisha.
Ha!
A change of dynasty had occurred in Damascus, 210 where Ben-Hadad II, the same king who had warred with Ahab, had been suffocated by his confidential servant Hazael, who seized the
I'll
throne.
let that get too far
Hazael was
along.
desirous of
I
regaining
really
the
don't.
conquered portions of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, which had been lost by Ben-Hadad. He first directed his attacks against the tribes on the other side of the Jordan. Joram of Israel repaired with his army to Ramoth-Gilead in order to defend that important fortress. The contest for the citadel seems to have been a severe one, and Joram was wounded by an arrow. In consequence, he went to Jezreel to have his wound attended to, and left one of his captains, named Jehu, as commander of the defense. One day a disciple of the prophets came to Jehu as a messenger from Elisha, and after leading him from the council of warriors to a distant room, where he appointed him the executor of divine justice on the house of Omri, he disappeared as suddenly as he had come. When Jehu returned to the council, they observed a change in his manner, and eagerly asked him what the disciple of the prophets had pronounced to him. Jehu at first did not wish to reply, but at last he disclosed to them that at Elisha's instance he had been anointed king over the 10 tribes. The chiefs of the army did him homage. Improvising had thrown by spreading their purple garments on the highest steps of the palace, amid trumpet blasts they shouted, Long live King Jehu! Having been acknowledged king by the army, Jehu proceeded without delay to carry out his design. He blockaded all the roads leading from Ramoth-Gilead to Jezreel, so that the news might not spread. He then led forth a part of the army, crossed the Jordan, and rode east to Jezreel, where Joram still lay from the effects of the twin. The king recognized Jehu from afar, by his rapid driving, and as the messenger whom he had sent out to meet him failed to return, he foreboded evil. Joram therefore ordered his chariot that he to 11 might see what had brought Jehu to Jezreel in such hot haste. Ahaziah, the king of Judah who had shortly before this succeeded to the throne of his father Joram, 888, accompanied his uncle. They met Jehu in the field of Nebaioth, the victim of the judicial murder which Jezebel had brought about. When Joram saw that Jehu had come with hostile intentions, he turned to flee, but an arrow from Jehu's hand struck him, and he sank down lifeless in his chariot. Jehu ordered his follower Bidkar to cast the body into the field of Naboth, reminding him how they had been witnesses of the prophetic threat which Elijah had uttered against Ahab in that very field, and of the execution of which he was now the instrument. Ahaziah fell on the same day at the hands of Jehu's followers. The destruction of the house of Ahab was imminent, and no one arose in its defense. Jehu entered Jezreel unmolested. The queen mother, Jezebel, richly decked out, came to the palace window, and called, How goes it, thou regicide, thou Zimri? Jehu commanded the eunuchs of the palace to throw her into the street, and they obeyed. The body of the queen who had done so much harm was trampled down by the horses, and her blood spurted on the wall of the house and over the horses. Naboth was not yet, however, fully avenged by the death of the son and the grandmother. There were still sons, grandsons, and relations of Joram, about 70 in number, who lived in Samaria, where they were trained and educated by the most respected men. To these men Jehu sent a message that they should appoint one of the royal family as king. They, however, knew that this charge was not to be taken seriously, and preferred to submit to the man who had already killed 2 kings. Jehu then ordered them to come with the heads to Jezreel, and thereupon they came with the heads of Ahab's descendants. Jehu placed the heads in 2 rows on the city gates, and the next 2:12 morning he explained to the inhabitants of the city that, while he had only conspired against Jehu, Jetson had fulfilled the words of Elijah concerning the house of Ahab. Jehu combined cunning with determination. He had all the officers who had brought his victims executed as murderers. There being now no survivor of the royal house, Jehu took possession of the throne, and the inhabitants of Jezreel gave him homage. In order to gain the hearts of the nation, he made preparations to exterminate the worship of Baal in Samaria. On his road thither he met with Jonadab, who had adopted the Nazarite mode of life as introduced by Elijah. Together with Jonadab, Jehu went to Samaria, where he assembled the priests of Baal on a certain day. While pretending to join in their rites, he placed armed men inside and outside the temple of Baal, and went there accompanied by Jonadab. Hardly had the sacrifice been offered, when all the priests fell as victims. The soldiers killed all those inside the temple, and those who fled were cut down by the men stationed outside. The soldiers then rushed in, burned the images, destroyed the altar, the columns, and also the temple, and converted the whole into a dunghill. Throughout the country Jehu destroyed the public monuments of the hideous idol worship, for he professed to be a follower of Elijah, and zealous in the cause of Jehovah. In Jerusalem alone the worship of Baal continued, or rather it was fanatically upheld there by Athaliah, who was in every way the worthy daughter of her mother. 213. Chapter 7. The house of David and the Joabites. Athaliah's rule. Early years of Joash. Proclamation of Joash by Jehoiada. Athaliah slain. Religious revival. Elisha. Preparing of the temple. Death of Jehoiada and of his son. Invasion of Israel by Hazael. Jehoaz. Murder of Joash, king of Judah. Jehush, king of Israel. Peace of the Arameans. Amaziah. Conquest of Edom. Death of Elisha. Amaziah defeated by Jehush. Jeroboam II. Death of Amaziah. 887-805 BCE. It is a striking fact that Israeli women, the appointed priestesses of chastity and morality, displayed a special inclination for the immoral worship of Baal and Astartes. Baasha, the queen mother in Judah, established an altar in Jerusalem for the worship of idols. Jezebel had erected one in Samaria, and now Athaliah followed the same course in Jerusalem. Yet, this was not Athaliah's solo nor the greatest sin. The daughter of Jezebel greatly surpassed her mother in cruelty. The victims of Jezebel had been prophets, sworn adherents to the ancestral law, T.O.N.s, persons whom she considered as her enemies. Athaliah, however, showed the blood of her own relations, and did not hesitate to destroy the family of her husband and her son. No sooner had she received tidings of the death of her son Ahaziah, than she ordered the soldiers devoted to her cause to execute all the surviving members of the house of David in Jerusalem. Only the youngest of the princes, Joash, who was not quite blameworthy, was saved from sharing the fate of his brothers by the special intervention of Jehoshaphar. What did Jezebel's bloodthirsty daughter expect to accomplish by this massacre? Was her wickedness the outcome 214 of an ambitious scheme to gain possession of the throne, to the exclusion of all rebels? Or did Athaliah, herself a firm believer in the worship of Baal, desire to establish and diffuse this worship throughout Jerusalem and Judah, and was it in pursuance of the design that she destroyed the remnants of the house of David, in order to have her hands unfettered? Did she hope to succeed where her mother had failed, and by establishing idolatrous practices in Jerusalem, to give new fervor to the Phaeacian worship? Whatever motive actuated the worthy daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, Athaliah reduced the Judeans to so complete a subservience to her will that no one dared oppose her evil courses. The nation and the priests bowed before her. Even the high priest, Jehoiada, who was connected with the royal house, kept silence. At the very time when Jehu was destroying those emblems of idolatry in Samaria, there was erected in Jerusalem an image of Baal, with altars and pointed pillars, and a high priest, named Mattan, with a number of subordinate priests, was appointed and installed. Did Athaliah leave the temple on Mount Moriah untouched and undesecrated? It appears that she, less consistent in her daring and more timid than later Salbrins, did not venture to introduce an image of Baal into the sanctuary which Solomon had erected, but merely inhibited its use for divine services. The Carians, mercenary troops employed by Athaliah, and the old royal bodyguard were placed at the entrance of the temple, to keep off the people. For this purpose, they were divided into 3 bodies, which by turns guarded the temple from Sabbath to Sabbath. For 6 years 887-881, Athaliah governed the political and religious affairs of the nation, the more aristocratic of the Jewish families probably being of her party. Only the nearest relative of the royal family, the high priest Jehoiada, remained true to the ancient 215 teachings and to the house of David. His wife, Jehoshaphar, was a daughter of King Joram of Judah, and the sister of the king Ahaziah who had been slain by Jehu. When Athaliah was ruthlessly killing the last remnants of the house of David, Jehoshaphar rescued the youngest child of her brother from the massacre, and brought him and his nurse into the chamber in the temple where the Levites slept. Here she secreted the royal infant for a considerable time, and reared him for his country. Athaliah troubled herself but little as to what was happening in the deserted temple, and the Aaronites and Levites, who remained faithful to Jehoiada, betrayed nothing. His very youth aroused their interest in the last descendants of the house of David. During the 6 years while Athaliah was ruling with absolute power in Jerusalem, Jehoiada did not remain idle, but entered into friendly relations with the chiefs of the Carians and the Guards, gradually revealing the fact that the youthful prince was still in existence, filling the throne of Judah by right law. He found them well disposed towards the royal house, and was the usurper Athaliah. When he had convinced himself of their sympathy with his views, he led them to the temple, and showed them Joash, who was then 7 years of age. The soldiers having recognized in him the rightful heir to the throne, probably by his resemblance to the family of David, Jehoiada demanded that the chiefs take the young of people to trial. The Christians who could pursue after revolution, and to restore the royal line. The chiefs could reckon on the blind obedience of their followers, and, accordingly, the plan of action was decided on, as well as the date for its execution. One Sabbath, the division of the Carians spent on guard went to their posts, whilst 2/3 occupied the entrance of the temple. They had all received strict orders to kill anyone who should cross the 216 boundaries of the temple courts with hostile intentions. As the prince was now secure from all attacks, Jehoiada also permitted the populace to enter the temple courts. At a thrilling moment, when the Garians and guards stood with drawn swords, and whilst the chiefs held the weapons used by David, the high priest led the child Josh from the room in which he had been concealed, put the crown on his head, anointed him as king, and made him mount the pillar-like throne which had been brought into the courts of the temple for King Zeus. Amid trumpet blasts and clashing of arms, the people clapped their hands, and cried, "Long live King Josh!" Not until the noise from the temple reached Athaliah's palace was she roused from the indifference and security which a belief in the fidelity of her paid troops had encouraged in her. She hurriedly repaired to the temple, accompanied by a few attendants. There, to her terror, she beheld a young child with a crown on his head, surrounded by her troops, who were protecting him, and by a crowd of people shouting with delight. She found herself betrayed, rent her clothes, and cried, "Conspiracy! Conspiracy!" Some of her captains immediately seized her, led her by a circuitous path out of the temple courts to the eastern gates of the palace, and there killed her. Thus the last grandchild of the house of Omri perished as disgracefully as her mother had done. The close connection of Israel with Tyre had brought no happiness to either kingdom. The mother and the daughter, Jezebel and Athaliah, resembled their goddess Astarte, the authoress of destruction, death, and ruin. Ahab's daughter does not appear to have had many adherents in Jerusalem. In the hour of death she found no partisans. Her priests of Baal were powerless to help her, for they themselves perished, the victims of the nation's wrath. Jehoiada, having planned and effected the 217 Great Revolution, now endeavored to take precautions against the repetition of similar misfortunes in Jerusalem. He utilized the joyous and enthusiastic sentiments of the youthful king and the nation to remove all traces of the worship of Baal, and to arouse in all minds a faithful dependence on the God of their ancestors. He demanded of the king and the whole assembly a solemn promise to remain henceforth the people of God, to serve him faithfully, and to worship no idol. The promise, which was uttered aloud by the king and the nation, was sealed by a covenant. The inhabitants of Jerusalem poured into the temple of Baal, which had been erected by Athaliah, destroyed the altars, trampled on the images and all objects connected with idol worship. The nation itself undertook to protect its own religion. It was not till after the covenant had been ratified both by the young king and the nation, that Josh, triumphantly escorted by the guards, the soldiers, and the multitude, was led from the temple mount into the palace, where he was placed on the throne of his fathers. Jerusalem was in a state of joyful excitement. The adherents of the late king kept quiet, and did not dare damp the general enthusiasm. It is remarkable that in the political and religious revolutions which followed each other in quick succession in Samaria and Jerusalem, Elisha's helping hand was not felt. He had commissioned one of his disciples to anoint Jehu as the avenger of the crimes of Omri's house, but he himself remained in the background, not even presenting himself at the overthrow of Baal. He does not appear to have had any interest with King Jehu, and still less did Elijah's chief disciple take any part in the fall of Athaliah and the overthrow of idolatry in Jerusalem. He seems to have occupied himself chiefly with the instruction of prophetic disciples, in order to keep alive the religious ardor which Elijah had kindled. Elisha, however, 218 was not, like his teacher, universally recognized as leader. He was reproached for not wearing long flowing hair, and thus creating the impression that he laid less stress on the Nazarite mode. Sons of prophetic disciples of Bethel jeered at him, and called him Balto. Elisha also differed from his master in associating with his fellow men, instead of passing his life in solitude as Elijah had done. It is true that as long as the Amorites were in power, he remained on Mount Carmel, thence he came, accompanied by his disciple Gehazi, to visit the prophetic schools in the Jordanic territories. But later on, he made Samaria his dwelling place, and was known under the title of the prophet of Samaria. Through his friendly intercourse with men, he exercised a lasting influence on them, and imbued them with his beliefs. Men of note sought him to obtain his advice, and the people generally visited him on Sabbaths and new moons. It was only in the kingdom of Judah and in Jerusalem that Elisha did not appear. Why did he avoid this territory? Or, why have no records of his relations with it been preserved? Was he not of the same disposition as the high priest Jehoiada, and had they not both the same end in view? It seems that the violent prophetic measures of Elijah and Elisha were not much appreciated in Jerusalem. Elijah had built an altar on Carmel, and had there offered up sacrifices. But though he did so in the name of the same God whose temple was in Jerusalem, his conduct was doubtless not countenanced by the priesthood. It was contrary to the law. And Elisha would hardly have been a welcome guest in Jerusalem. There, attention was concentrated on the sanctuary and the law from the moment when Jehoiada had shown himself their strict guardian. The temple had suffered injury under Athaliah. Not only had the holy covering of Sale been in part destroyed, but entire blocks had been violated full 219 out of the walls. It was therefore an important matter for the young King Josh, at the beginning of his reign, to repair these damages, and Jehoiada impressed upon him the necessity of this undertaking. The means, however, were wanting. Whatever treasure might have been in the temple he accumulated offerings and former kings of pious stone had, without doubt, been transferred by Athaliah to the house of Baal. The king therefore commanded the priests to collect money for effecting the necessary repairs, and bade them engage in this work with as much energy as though it were their own affair. Every Amorite was to obtain contributions from his acquaintances, and out of the sums thus collected the expenses of repairing the temple were to be defrayed. Whether it was that the monies received were insufficient, or that the priests used them for their own purposes, the repairs were for a long time not attempted. At length the king ordered the high priest Jehoiada 864 to enlist the interest of the nation in the work on hand. A chest with a slit in it was placed in the courtyard of the temple, and into that chest all whom piety or generosity influence might raise a free will offering, each according to his needs, or he might give his contribution to the priests, who would deposit it in the chest. The gifts were liberal, and proved sufficient to procure materials, and to pay the masons and carpenters. Jehoiada raised the position of the high priest, which until then, even under the best kings, had been a subordinate one, in equality with that of royalty. Had not the high priest, through his wisdom and energy, saved the kingdom? Would not the last descendants of the house of David have been destroyed, if Jehoiada had not rescued him from the bloodthirsty Athaliah? He could justly claim that the high priest should henceforth have an important voice in all matters of state. Jehoiada used his influence to secure due respect for the law, and to avoid a recurrence of the deplorable period of apostasy. The 220 strife between the royal power and that of the priests was inevitable, for the former, from its very nature, was dependent on personal disposition, whilst the latter was based on established laws. During the lifetime of Jehoiada, to whom Josh owed everything, the contest did not break out. Josh may have been prompted by gratitude and respect to submit to the orders of the high priest, and when Jehoiada died, he gave him the honor of burial in the royal mausoleum in the city of David. After Jehoiada's death, however, a contest arose between his son and successor Zechariah and the king, which cost the former his life. The details have not reached us. It has only been stated that at Joshua's command some princes of Judah stoned the son of Jehoiada in the temple courts, and that the young high priest, in his dying moments, exclaimed, "May God take account of this and avenge it." In every other respect, the overthrow of the house of Omri, which had caused so many differences and quarrels in Samaria and Jerusalem, had resulted in the internal peace of both kingdoms. The present condition was tolerable, except that private altars still existed in the kingdom of Judah, and that the God of Israel was still worshipped under the form of a bull in the kingdom of the 10 tribes. The worship of Baal was, however, banished from both kingdoms. From without, both lands were harassed by enemies. Jehu, the bold chief of horsemen, who had destroyed the house of Omri in Jezreel and Samaria, did not display the same energy against powerful foreign enemies. Still, the Araman Regicide, who was carrying warlike undertakings and eager for conquest, attacked the land of Israel with his troops, took the citadels by storm, burned the houses, and spared neither children nor women. He also conquered the towns on the other side of the Jordan. The entire district of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, from the mountains of Bashan to the Arnon, was to 21 snatched from the kingdom of the 10 tribes. Many of the inhabitants were crushed to death under iron plowshares. The survivors were reduced to a state of semi-bondage. Jehu was not in a position to hold his ground against Hazael, perhaps because he also met with opposition from the king of Tyre, whose relatives had Elizeh had slain. Matters fared still worse under his son Jeho's 859-845. The land had been so hard pressed by Hazael and his son Ben-Hadad, and the Israelites had been so reduced in strength, that their available forces consisted of but 10,000 infantry, 50 horse soldiers, and 10 war chariots. From time to time the Aramenes made inroads, carried off booty and captured prisoners, whom they treated and sold as slaves. Jehu appears to have concluded a disgraceful feat to the conqueror, that his troops keep granted free passage through his lands. Thereupon Hazael overran the land of the Philistines with his warriors, and besieged and conquered the town of Gath. He then intended to advance against Jerusalem, but Josh submitted without a stroke and fought peace. Either popular discontent was aroused by his cowardice, or he had in other ways caused this affection. At all events, several nobles of Judah conspired against him, and two of them, Joseph and Jehozaman, killed him in a house where he chanced to be staying. Josh, king of Israel 845-830, at last succeeded in gradually reducing the preponderance of the Araman kingdom. Probably this was owing to the fact that the neighboring kings of the Hittites who dwelt on the Euphrates, as well as the king of Egypt, envious of the power of Damascus, took hostile positions towards Ben-Hadad. The latter, in order to weaken or destroy the kingdom of the 10 tribes, laid close siege to the capital, Samaria, until all food was consumed, and the distress was so great that the head of an ass was sold for 82
Danger
shekels,
noodle.
and a load of dung, for fuel, for 5 shekels. Few of the workhorses survived, and these were so emaciated that they were incapacitated for service. The famine drove 2 women to such extremities that they determined to kill many of their children. The Aramenes, however, unexpectedly raised the siege and hurried away, leaving their tents, horses, asses, valuables, and provisions behind them. The king, to whom this discovery was communicated by some half-starved lepers, was once more encouraged. He gave battle to Ben-Hadad on 3 occasions, and defeated him in each combat. The king of Damascus saw himself compelled to make peace with the king of Israel, and to restore the towns which his father Hazael had taken from the territory of the 10 tribes on the east side of the Jordan. The weakening of Syria of Damascus had a favorable effect on the fortunes of Judah under King Amaziah 843-816. Damascus had accorded its protection to the petty commonwealths of Moab, Ammon, and Edom, which stood in hostile relations to Israel and Judah. Ben-Hadad's humiliation set free Amaziah's hands, and enabled him to reconquer the former possessions of the house of David. The small territory of Edom had freed itself from vassalage about half a century before.
Oh
One
well.
of the Edomite kings had built a new capital on an eminence announced
So much for that.
chalk and porphyry rocks. It rose at a height of 4,000 feet above the sea level. A pathway led up to it from the valley below. In this mountain city Petra, 15 miles south of the Dead Sea, the Edomites hoped to remain secure from all attacks. Edom sit proudly, who shall bring him down to the ground. Amaziah had the courage to attack the Edomites in their mountain fastnesses. A battle was fought in the Salt Valley, not far from the Dead Sea, where Amaziah caused great destruction among the enemy. The survivors taken to flight.
Danger noodle.
Having captured
Trying to just get
Edom,
so hot.
for some unknown reason, changed its name to that of Judah.
So hot.
Doubtless rich booty followed the successful campaign, for Edom was a country rich not only in flocks, but also in metals. Amaziah was not a little proud of his victory. But his pride led to his own ruin, and to the misfortune of his people. A peaceful understanding existed between Jehu and his successors, and the kingdom of Judah. Although no such formal alliance as between the Amorites and Jehoshaphat had been concluded between them, yet they had a common interest in keeping down the appearance of the Baal worship. Both kings, Jehu's judge of Israel and Amaziah of Judah, were devoted to the ancient law. When executing judgment against the murderers of his father, Amaziah, contrary to the barbarous customs of his time, spared their sons an act of leniency which must not be underestimated. Most probably the high priest, or some other representative of the law, had impressed upon him that the religion of Israel forbids the infliction of suffering upon children for the sins of their fathers, or upon fathers for the sins of their children. In Israel, Jehu showed deep respect for the prophet Elisha, and followed his counsel in all important matters. When, after more than 50 years of activity 900-840, Elisha lay on his deathbed, the king visited the prophet, lamented his approaching end, and called him the father and guardian of Israel. After Elisha's death, the king ordered Gehazi, Elisha's constant follower, to recount all the important deeds which the prophet had performed. And when the Shunammite woman, whom Gehazi mentioned in connection with the prophet's work, appeared before the king, accusing a man who, during her absence, had taken unlawful possession of her house and field, the mere fact that Elisha had once been interested in her, sufficed to induce the king to order her immediate 224 reinstatement. Great, indeed, must have been the prophet's personal sway over his contemporaries, since the king submitted to his guidance. Elisha also gained a great triumph for the law of God, though without any effort on his part. A prominent Gentile, the Syrian general Naaman, who was the inferior only of the king of the Araman country, voluntarily renounced the impious worship of Baal and Astartes, and acknowledged the God of Israel, as Elisha's ministry produced in him the conviction that only in Israel the true God was worshipped. He even carried with him earth from the land of Israel to Damascus, in order to erect his private altar, as it were, on holy ground. Meanwhile, although the desire existed in both kingdoms to free themselves from foreign influences, and to remain true to themselves, internal differences had already taken such deep root that it was impossible for them to pursue the same road. After the return of Amaziah from his conquest of the Edomites, he conceived the bold idea of proceeding with his army against the kingdom of the 10 tribes, in order to reconquer it. As a pretext, he appears to have demanded the daughter of the king of Israel as a bride for his son, intending to regard a refusal as a justification for war. Jehush tearfully replied, the thorn bush once said to the cedar of Lebanon, give thy daughter as a wife to my son. Thereupon the wild beasts of the Lebanon came forth, and trod down the thorn bush. Because thou hast conquered Edom, thy heart grows proud. Guard thine honor, and remain at home. Why wilt thou plunge thyself into misfortune, that Judah may fall with thee? But Amaziah refused to yield, and sent his army to the borders of the kingdom of Israel. Jehush, encouraged by the victory he had just obtained over the Aramenes, went forth to meet him. A battle was fought on the frontier at Beth-Shemesh, where the men of Judah sustained a considerable defeat, and 225 fled. Amaziah himself was taken prisoner by the king of Israel. One must consider it an unusual act of leniency that Jehush did not abuse his ruined victory, and that he did not even actively follow it up. Could he not dethrone the captive Amaziah, declare the house of David to be extinct, and merge the kingdom of Judah into his own realm? This, however, he did not do, but contented himself with destroying the walls of Jerusalem, and ransacking the town, the palace, and the temple. Jerusalem, which since then has been the scene of repeated devastations, was, for the first time since its foundation, captured and partly destroyed by the king of Israel. Jehush magnanimously set the captured monarch at liberty, but demanded hostages. The moderation displayed by Jehush was no doubt due to the influence of the prophet Elisha or his disciples. After the death of Jehush 830, Amaziah reigned for 15 years, but was not very successful in his undertakings. The power and extent of the Ephraimite kingdom, on the other hand, increased so rapidly that it seemed as though the times of David were about to return. Jeroboam too possessed greater military abilities than any of those who had preceded him since the division of the kingdom, and fortune befriended him. He enjoyed a very long reign 830-769, during which he was enabled to fight many battles and achieve various conquests. He appears first of all to have turned his arms against the Aramenes. They were the worst enemies of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and had kept up continuous attacks against it since the time of Ahab. The boundary of the kingdom of Israel extended from the road which led to Hamath, as far as the southeast river, which empties itself into the Red Sea. The prophet of this time, Jonah, the son of Amittai, from the town of Gath-Hefer, had encouraged Jeroboam to make war against the Aramenes. The king also seems to have conquered the district 226 of Moab, and to have annexed it to the kingdom of the 10 tribes. Amaziah's efforts, meanwhile, were impeded by the humiliation he had had to undergo. Jerusalem having been deprived of its fortifications, Amaziah could not undertake any war, and was well content to be left unmolested. He had promised not to repair the walls, and he had been obliged to leave hostages in the Israelitish capital as pledges of his good faith. The nobles and the nation in general had ample reason for discontent. Amaziah had injured the country by his presumption. It was through his rashness that Jerusalem was left defenseless against every hostile attack. The hostages, these vouchers for the continuance of his humiliation, doubtless belonged to the most respected families, and their forced exile helped to nourish the discontent of the nobles, which finally culminated in a conspiracy. A violent conflict arose in Jerusalem, the people either siding with the conspirators, or taking no part in the contest. Amaziah was helpless, and sought safety in flight. The conspirators, however, followed him to Lachish about 15 hours' journey southwest of Jerusalem, where he had taken refuge, and there killed him. He was the third king of the house of David who had fallen by the sword, and the second who had fallen at the hands of conspirators. After the death of Amaziah, Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah experienced still greater misfortunes. The princes of Judah, who had dethroned and killed the king, do not appear to have resigned the reins of government which they had seized. Amaziah's only surviving son, Azariah called also Uzziah, was a child of 4 or 5 years of age, and the land was surrounded by enemies. Advantage was taken of this helpless condition of the country by the Aramenes, who had been beaten and disgraced by Amaziah. They commenced an attack on the kingdom of Judah, and Egypt again espoused their cause, 227 as it had done in the times of the children. Sanguinary battles ensued, and the Aramenes took many prisoners. They pressed upon Jerusalem, where the breaches in the walls had not yet been repaired, and carried off numbers of captives. There are no further particulars known of the attack of the Aramenes. Some domains seem to have been separated from Judah, and annexed to Edom and Egypt respectively. The rude warriors exchanged shed envoys and girls for wine and prostitutes, and their new masters, chiefly Philistines, in turn sold them to the Ionians, who at that time vied with the Phaeacians in the pursuit of slave trading. The Tyrians, forgetful of their long-standing alliance with the house of David, behaved in no friendlier manner. This was the first dispersion of Judanes to distant lands, whither the Ionians had sold them as slaves. It was probably these Jewish slaves who brought the first germs of higher morals and culture to the Western nations. Amongst the prisoners were many noble youths and beautiful maidens of Jerusalem, who, owing to their home influences, and their knowledge of the eventful history of their nation, carried with them a store of ideas, which they came to appreciate more now than they ever had done at home. 228. Chapter XII. End of the house of Jehu and the time of Uzziah. Condition of Judah. The earthquake and the famine. Uzziah's rule. Overthrow of neighboring powers. Fortification of Jerusalem. Navigation of the Red Sea. Jeroboam's prosperity. The sons of the prophets. Amos. Prophetic eloquence. Joel's prophecies. Hosea foretells ultimate peace. Denunciation of Uzziah. Zechariah, Shalom, Menahem. Last years of Uzziah. Contest between the king and the high priest. Uzziah usurps the priestly functions. Uzziah's illness. 805-758 BCE. After the violent death of Amaziah, the kingdom of Judah or house of Jacob had become so excessively weakened, partly through internal dissensions and partly through foreign warfare, that it was a byword among the nations. Contemporary prophet called it the crumbling house of David, and oftentimes repeated, who will raise Jacob, seeing that he is so small. And yet from out of this weakness and debasement Judah once more rose to such power that it inspired the neighboring peoples with fear.
100,000
First the
damage,
internal dissensions had to be set at rest. The
I
entire nation of
understand.
Judah rose up against the nobles that had committed regicide a second time and created confusion. the young Prince Azariah, or Uzziah, was made king. This king who was only 17 years old, and who, like his contemporary, King Jeroboam, enjoyed a long reign of zest, energy, determination, and passion, which enabled him to restore the crumbling house of David.
Bad kidding.
His first care was to transport the corpse of his father from Lachish, where it had been buried, to Jerusalem, where it was interred with the remains of the other kings of the house of David. Whether Uzziah 2:29 punished the murderers of his father cannot be ascertained. He then proceeded to heal the wounds of his country, but the task was a difficult one, for he not only had to contend with enemies within the state itself and among the neighboring nations, but also against untoward circumstances. The very forces of nature seemed to have conspired against the land, which was devastated by a succession of calamities calculated to reduce the staunchest heart to despair and apathy. In the first place, an earthquake occurred in Uzziah's time, which terrified the inhabitants of Palestine, who were unused to such occurrences. The people took to flight, shrieking with terror, expecting every moment to be engulfed in a bliss beneath the quivering earth. Non-accompanying the earthquake increased their terror. The sun was hidden by a sudden, thick fog, which wrapped everything in darkness, and the lightning flashes which, from time to time, illuminated it, added to the prevailing terror. The moon and stars appeared to have lost their light. The sea, stirred up in its depths, roared and thundered, and its deafening sound was heard far off. The terrors of the earthquake were intensified when the people recalled the fact that a prophet, belonging to the kingdom of the 10 tribes, had predicted the event 2 years before. The fulfillment of this awful prophecy filled all hearts with consternation. The end of the world seemed at hand. Hardly had this terror subsided when a fresh misfortune broke upon them. The periodical falls of rain failed, no dew quickened the fields, a prolonged drought parched all vegetation, the springs dried up, a scorching sun transformed the meadows and pasture lands into a desert, men and cattle thirsted for refreshment and food, whilst wild beasts wandered panting about in the forest wilderness. Inhabitants of cities in which the water supply was exhausted set out for the nearest place, hoping to find a supply there, but were too quickly unable to satisfy their thirst. The drought, affecting extended areas of land, reached also the lava districts of Haran in northeastern Palestine, which are not unfrequently infested with swarms of locusts. In search of nourishment, these locusts now flew across the Jordan to the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and devoured all that had not been withered by the dry rot. In heavy swarms which obscured the sun, they flew onward, and suddenly the vines, fig and pomegranate trees, the palms and the apple trees were laid bare. These devastations by the locusts continued throughout several years. In the land of Judah, which had been brought to the verge of destruction by the reverses of war, the consternation was deep. It seemed as though God had deserted his heritage, people, country and temple, and had given them over to degradation and ruin. Public mourning and pilgrimages were instituted in order to avert the evil. The prophet Joel, the son of Tebuel, exhorted the people publicly in these days of trouble, and was largely instrumental in raising their sinking courage. His stern exhortations did not fall leaving a deep impression. Their effect was especially felt when the destruction caused by the drought and the locust ceased. Once more field and garden began to burst into blossom, the brooks and cisterns were filled, and scarcity was at an end. The young king immediately availed himself of this auspicious change, in order to chastise the enemies of Judah. He first turned his arms against the Edomites, who had laid his land waste. He defeated them, possibly because they were no longer aided by the Egyptians, and reduced Edom to subjection. The town of Elah, on the shore of the Red Sea, he re-annexed to Judah, and the maritime trade with Arabia and Ophir and India could thus be renewed. The Nemites or Minites, who occupied a small territory in Edom, around the city of Neman, were subjugated by Uzziah, and compelled 231 to pay tribute. He punished the Philistines for their hostile attitude towards Judah during his minority, when they had delivered over the Judean refugees and immigrants to the Edomites. He conquered the towns of Gad, Ashdod, Jabin, which lay nearest to the land of Judah, and raised their walls. In other portions of Philistia, which he annexed to his own territory, he erected fortified cities. He especially devoted himself to the task of fortifying Jerusalem, which, owing to the destruction of 400 yards of the northern wall at the time of the war between his father and Jehoash of Israel, could offer no resistance to any enemy. Uzziah, therefore, had the northern wall rebuilt, and undoubtedly rendered it safer than before against attacks. He must have established friendly relations with Jeroboam too, or he would not have been able to commence the fortifications without risking a war. Uzziah had 3 towers built, each 150 yards in height, at the corner gate to the north, at the gate leading to the valley of Hinnom in the south, and at the gate Hinnom. On the gates and on the parapets of the walls were placed machines which on it, by means of which heavy stones could be hurled to great distances. Uzziah, in general, displayed great energy in making warlike preparations, the warriors being provided with shields, armor and spears. He also employed cavalry and war chariots, like those brought from Egypt in Solomon's time. Uzziah appears, in all respects, to have taken Solomon's kingdom as his model. The navigation of the Red Sea, from the harbor of Eilat, which Solomon had obtained from the Edomites, was again resumed, and great vessels ships of Tarshish were fitted out for the purpose. Altogether, Uzziah attained a position of predominance over the neighboring nations. The kingdom of the 10 tribes, at the same time, became possessed of great power under Jeroboam II,
That's what happened.
who was as warlike as Uzziah. In the latter part of his long reign he was engaged in continual warfare with the Syrians. He conquered the capital, Damascus, and pressed victoriously to the city of Hamath, which also fell before him. The nationalities which inhabited the district from Lebanon to the Euphrates, and which till then had paid allegiance to the kingdom of Damascus, became tributary to the king of Israel in consequence of these victories. Jeroboam had no longer any rival in his vicinity to contest the supreme power with him. The Peachitians had become considerably weakened through dissensions between the city of Tyre and the descendants of King Ephraim. During Jeroboam's government a civil war appears to have broken out in Tyre, in consequence of which the whole of Peachisha lost the influential position which it had been occupying for a considerable time. The rich booty of war, and, perhaps, the renewed impulse to trade, brought wealth to the entire country of Samaria. Not only the king, but even the nobles and the wealthy classes, lived in luxury surpassing that of Solomon's time. King Jeroboam possessed a winter and a summer palace. Houses of bloodstone, adorned with ivory and furnished with ivory seats, became very common. In contemplating the increase of power in the 2 kingdoms, one might have been tempted to believe that the times of Solomon were not yet over, and that no change had occurred, except that 2 kings were ruling instead of one, and no breach had ever taken place, or that the wounds once inflicted had been healed. Jeroboam and Uzziah appear to have lived on terms of perfect peace with one another. Israelites were permitted to make pilgrimages to Beersheba. No doubt some of them also visited the temple in Jerusalem. But it was only the last glimmer of a politically happy period. The corruption which prosperity helped to develop in the kingdom of Judah, and still more conspicuously in the 233 kingdom of the 10 tribes, soon put an end to these happy days, and hastened the decadence of both states. In Iraq, the bull worship was not only continued in Bethel and Dan, but even assumed greater proportions, and additional images of the bull were erected in Samaria and in Gilgal. Jeroboam appears to have elevated Bethel to the rank of capital. Here the chief sanctuary was established. A sort of high priest, named Amaziah, ministered there, and appears to have been very jealous of his office. Unlike the Aaronites in Judah, he enjoyed a rich revenue possession of fields around Bethel. Either this perverted form of worship was not yet low enough to satisfy the cravings of its devotees, or the voluptuousness consequent upon the accession of wealth may have demanded new departures. At all events, the hideous worship of Baal and the immoral cult of Astarte were again introduced. It is extraordinary that this idolatry, which had been extirpated with so much energy by Jehu, was again promoted, and received fresh encouragement under his grandson. The idolatry thus newly reintroduced brought in its train every species of wickedness and corruption. In order to gratify the senses, all hearts were bent on acquiring riches. The wealthy made usury their business, and pursued their debtors with such severity as to make slaves of their impoverished debtors or their children. Usurious trade in corn was especially prevalent. In years of famine the rich opened their granaries, and sold the necessaries of life on credit, not always without employing false weights and measures. And when the poor were unable to return what had been lent to them, they heartlessly took their clothes or even their persons in pledge. When these unfortunates uttered their complaint against such injustice in the national assemblies, they found no ear to listen. For the judges were either themselves among the evildoers, or had been bribed and made 234 deaf to the voice of justice. The treasures thus extorted were wasted by their owners in daily revelry. The contemporary prophet Amos pictures in gloomy colors the dugout life of the rich and noble Israelites residing in the capitals in Jeroboam's time. 20 the wives of the nobles followed the bad examples of their husbands, and urged them to be hard-hearted to the poor, demanding of them, bring, and let us drink. The people itself could not, however, be so much influenced by the moral depravity of the nobles as to allow it to obtain full sway. Morality, justice, and pure worship of God still had followers, who protested more and more strongly against the vices practiced by the great, and who, though in humble positions, knew how to obtain a hearing. Although almost a century had passed since the prophet Elijah, with flowing hair, declaimed against the sins of Ahab and Jezebel, the prophetic societies which he had founded still existed, and acted according to his spirit and with his energy. The young, who are generally ready to receive ideal impressions, felt a disgust at the increasing moral ruin which came on them, and assembled around prophetic disciples in Bethel, Gilgal, and Jericho. The generation which Elisha had reared and taught adopted these symbols of prophecy, pursuing the same abstemious mode of life, and wearing long flowing hair. But they did not stop at such outward signs, but raised their voices against their religious errors, against luxury and immorality. Sons became the moral judges of their fathers. Youths gave up drinking wine, whilst the men rebelled in the drinking places. The youthful truth of prophets took the place of the warning voice of conscience. In the presence of king and nobles, they preached in the public assemblies against the worship of Baal, against immorality and the 235 heartlessness of the great. Did their numbers shield them from persecution, or were there amongst the ranks of the prophets sons of the great, against whom it was impossible to proceed with severity? Or was King Jeroboam more patient than the accursed Jezebel, who had slaughtered the prophets' disciples by hundreds? Or did he disregard and ignore their words? In any case, it is noteworthy that the zealous youths remained unharmed. The rebellers merely compelled them to drink wine and forbade them to preach. They derided the moral reformers who exposed their wrongdoings, but they did not persecute them. One of the prophets in the kingdom of the 10 tribes made use of this freedom of speech. He was the first of a succession of prophets who combined great and poetic thought with evenly flowing rhythm of diction, and made kings and grantees as well as the people wince under their incisive words of truth. It was Amos of Tekoa. Amos did not belong to the prophetic guild, he was no prophetic disciple, and probably neither wore a garment of haircloth, like Elijah, nor let his hair grow long, but was a simple herdsman and planter of sycamores. Whilst tending his herds, the prophetic spirit came mightily upon him, and he could not refrain from appearing in public. God spake to him, and in him, how should he not prophesy? The prophetic spirit urged him to repair to Bethel, and there, in the temporary capital of King Jeroboam II, he declaimed against the perversions and vices of the nobles, and opened their eyes to the consequences of their evil deeds. That a countryman, clad in shepherd's garb, dared speak publicly, did not help creating sensation in Bethel. A high degree of culture must have prevailed in those days in Samaria, when a shepherd was able to speak in beautiful, rhythmic utterances, and was understood, or at least expected to be understood, by the people. The speeches of Amos and 236, those of his successors, combined the eloquence and comprehensibility of prose with the meter and the rhythm of poetry. Metaphors and imagery lend additional solemnity to their diction. It is therefore difficult to decide whether these utterances should be classed as prose or as poetry. In place of a more suitable description, they may be designated as beautifully formed poetic eloquence. The orations of Amos, however, did not fail to betray this station. He used similes taken from his shepherd life. They showed that, while tending his flock, he often listened to the roaring of the lion, and studied the stars in his night watches. But these peculiarities only lent a special charm to his speeches. Amos came to Bethel before the earthquake occurred, and he predicted the event in words of prophetic foresight. The earthquake thereupon followed, with all its accompanying terrors, and carried desolation everywhere. The subsequent plagues of drought, sterility, and locusts afflicted the kingdom of the 10 tribes equally with the kingdom of Judah. Amos, and with him all right-minded people, expected that these visitations would effect a reform, putting an end to the hideous excesses of the wealthy and their cruel oppression and persecution of the poor. But no improvement took place, and Amos inveighed against the impenitent sinners in the severest terms. He refused men who ridiculed his prophetic utterances. He denounced those who, relying on their power or their piety or their nobility of descent, felt themselves unassailable. Amos v. 4-15, by 1-8. Against such daring speeches, directed even against the royal house, the high priest of Bethel, Amaziah, felt it his duty to take measures. Either from indifference or out of respect for the prophet, King Jeroboam seems hitherto to have allowed him unlimited sway. But even now, when Amaziah called his attention to the prophet's dangerous upbraidings, he appears to have remained unmoved. At all 237 events, the prophet was not interfered with, except that the high priest, probably in the king's name, said to him, "Go thou, haste to Judah. Eat thy bread and prophesy there, but in Bethel thou mayst not remain, for it is the sanctuary of the king, and the capital of the kingdom." Amos did not permit himself to be interrupted in his preaching further than to say, I am no prophet and no prophetic disciple, but only a shepherd and planter. But the Lord spake unto me, Go, prophesy unto my people Israel. In the strongest language, he concluded with the threat of punishment. It is noteworthy that he did not protest against the evil deeds in Judah with the same energy, but rather displayed a certain leniency towards the kingdom governed by the house of David. He entered into no particulars concerning the sins which were rife there, but only spoke of them in general terms. He predicted a happy future for the kingdom of Judah, while predicting woe to Israel. Behold, the eyes of the Lord God are upon the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from off the face of the earth. Saving that I will not utterly destroy the house of Jacob, said the Lord. When contemplating in his prophetic vision the new plagues which would descend upon the land, he interceded with prayer in behalf of Judah, exclaiming, Lord God, cease, I beseech thee. How shall Jacob rise, since he is so small? Amos 5:2-5. The state of weakness into which Judah had fallen since the death of Amaziah, and from which it had not yet recovered in the first years of Uzziah's reign, filled the prophet Amos with compassion. He did not wish to discourage the nation in the court still further, but prophesied the future reunion of the tribes under the house of David. At this time another prophet arose in Jerusalem, named Joel, the son of Pethuel. Most of the prophets were of obscure origin, and returned to obscurity 238 without leaving a trace of their individuality, which was entirely merged in their deeds or works. Joel appeared at a time when all minds had been terrified and driven into a condition of despair bordering on stupor, by the repeated attacks of the Edomites and neighboring nations, and the subsequent plagues of earthquake, drought and locusts. The inhabitants of Jerusalem and the country were wearing themselves away in long fasts and lamentations. They tore their garments as a sign of mourning, and assembled around the temple with cries and supplications to avert divine anger, and the priests were equally despondent. Joel, therefore, had a different task from that of Amos. Not to censure and blame the people was his mission, but to raise and cheer up the despondent, and to arouse those whom despair had stupefied. He did not openly denounce, but merely hinted at the sins and errors of the nation, alluding to the drunkards now left without wine, pointing to the external repentance which contented itself with torn garments and left the heart untouched, and scorning the popular notion that the deity could not be appeased without sacrifices. Joel had to exert the whole power of his eloquence in order to convince the nation that God's mercy had not departed from them, that Zion was yet his holy mountain, that he would not deliver up his people to disgrace, that he was long-suffering and full of mercy, and would relieve them from their misfortunes without their burnt offerings and fasts. Joel's oratorical power was, perhaps, even greater than that of Amos. His highly colored description of ravages of the locusts and the accompanying calamities is a stirring picture. The reader feels himself to be an eyewitness. The extant production of Joel's prophetic eloquence, with its rhythm and meter and even a certain strophic structure, also occupies the middle between poetry and prose. The only speech of his which has been preserved is divided 239 into two halves. In the one half he describes the misfortunes of the nation, blames their perverted ideas, and points out wherein their conversion must consist. And in the other, he seeks to fill their hearts with a joyous hope for the future. Joel endeavored to carry his trembling, wailing and despondent hearers, who had collected on the Temple Mount, beyond the narrow boundaries of their present sorrow to a higher view of life. He told them that God had sent the plagues as forerunners of a time full of earnestness and awe, of a day great and fearful, destined to purify them and lead to a higher moral order. The sorrows of the present would pass away and be forgotten. Then the great day of the Lord would dawn. Joel also predicted political changes, when the enslaved Jews of Judah and Jerusalem, whom Philistines and Tyrians had sold to slave trading Maonians, who again on their part had scattered them far and wide, should again return. The peoples who had committed acts of cruelty would be severely punished in the valley of justice in Shaphat, where God would pronounce judgment on all nations. Then Egypt and Edom would become deserts, because they had shed the innocent blood of the Judeans. But Judah and Jerusalem would be inhabited throughout all generations. Then a higher moral order would begin, and all creatures would be filled with the divine spirit of prophecy. And it shall come to pass afterwards that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit. Joel 80. 1-2. The which has been attributed to Moses numbers 29. Well, according to Joel's prophecy, be realized at some future time. Not only Israelites born in the land, but also the strangers, who lived as slaves in their families, would have a share in this 240 kingdom of God, and would become worthy of the gift of prophecy. Thus the prophetic vision began to roam beyond the national barriers. Hosea, son of Beeri, the third prophet of Jeroboam's and Uzziah's times, spoke yet more decidedly against the kingdom of the 10 tribes, and in favor of the house of Jacob. Nothing is known of his life and actions. We are not even told in which kingdom he delivered his speeches. It is, however, probable that the scene of his activity was Bethel or Samaria. Whilst Amos made moral corruption the main object of his rebuke and scorn, Hosea declaimed against the religious defection of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, which had returned to the worship of Baal. He did not possess the wealth of expression nor the metrical evenness of his two contemporaries. His eloquence comes nearer the form of common prose. It is more amplified, more fluent, but also more artificial. It lies the interweaving of allegorical names, in which Hosea probably followed the style of the prophetic school from which he appears to have come. He started from one simile, which he applied in a tupos manner. He represented the introduction of the Baal worship in the 10 tribes as the conduct of a faithless wife, and compared the future return of the people to God, which he predicted, to the return to the path of duty of a repentant and abashed adulteress. This was he premised with an introduction. In a prophetic vision, he said, he received the command to take to himself an adulterer's wife. Following this command, he married a woman of evil repute, who bore him 3 children, son, Jezreel, a daughter, whom he called unloved Lo-Ruhamah, and a second son, named not my nation Lo-Ami. The prophet explained these metaphorical names. Thus, Jezreel meant 2 things north the first place, that God would visit on the house of Jehu the blood that their forefather had shed in Jezreel. And further, Jezreel denoted that God would 241 destroy the armies of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. The name of the daughter meant that God would no longer care for the house of Israel. And, lastly, the name of the second son denoted that the God of Israel had deserted the nation, and would no longer be its God. After this introduction and its interpretation, the prophet began his address. Contend with your mother, content, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. Let her put away her prostitution from her face, and her adulteries from her bosom. Hosea E. 4-6. Then the prophet depicts the entire extent of the faithlessness of the house of Israel, an adulteress who pursues her lover Baal, in the belief that her riches and her plenty had come from him, forgetting that God had endowed her with the corn and wine, the silver and gold which she was wasting on the idol Baal. God would therefore deprive her of everything, and not leave her even sufficient clothes to cover her body. In her need she would be overcome by repentance, and say, I will return to my first love, for then it was better with me than now. The prophet then pictures the return of the faithless wife, who would remorsefully recognize the whole extent of her past wickedness, and, turning to her husband, would call him my husband, for the name Lord all would have become hateful to her. Hosea E. Reconciled with his betrothed nation, the Lord would again show mercy to her, as in the days of the Exodus from Egypt. From the desert he would again lead her to her land, and she would once more sing songs of praise as in the time of her youth, and in the days when she went forth from Egypt. The renewed covenant between her God and her would shield her from the wild beasts, and bow and sword and war would be no more. Jezreel, the ominous name, would receive an auspicious meaning planted in the 242 land. The unloved would be once more the beloved, and not my nation would again become my nation and would acknowledge his God. In unrolling a glowing picture of the future of the 10 tribes, Hosea did not desire to mislead his hearers into the belief that such a time was close at hand. In a second oration, which has probably not been fully preserved, he predicts that many unhappy days would intervene before the return of the 10 tribes and their expiation. This speech he also introduced with the account of a vision. God had commanded him again to take a much beloved, yet faithless wife. She was not to bear him children, but he was to keep himself apart from her, nor permit her to associate with other men. This vision denoted that, though God loved the Israelitish nation, she had, forgetting all ties of honor and duty, given her love to other gods. And it denoted further, that the sons of Israel would remain long without a king or a prince, without an altar or cause, without an ephod, as well as without house gods cherubim. Till at last, purified by severe trials, she would return to her God in the latter days. Hosea prophesied the total destruction of the kingdom of the 10 tribes. On the other hand, he laid even more stress than his contemporaries on the continuance of the house of David and the kingdom of Judah, at the same time reproaching King Uzziah for the importance which he attached to his warlike preparations. Corruption in the one kingdom and misfortunes in the other brought from the hidden depths precious or prophetic eloquence, which was destined to obtain wide-reaching influence. The sins of Ahab and Jezebel aroused Elijah. The evil deeds of Jeroboam II and his nobles drew Amos away from his flocks, and brought Hosea out of his quiet life into publicity, to communicate in a fascinating form the thoughts which possessed their souls. Their 243 fears and hopes, their thoughts and convictions, became thenceforth the common property of the many whom they inspired and ennobled. Anxiously listening disciples of the prophet imprinted these prophetic lessons on their memories or recorded them in writing. They formed the first pages of that prophetic literature, which was destined to stir up the indolent nations of the earth. By picturing, though only in dim outlines, the prospect of a better future, the prophetic wizards, Amos, Hosea and Joel, had ensured the permanence of the nation from which they sprung. For a nation which looks confidently forward to a happy future is safe against destruction, and does not permit itself to be crushed by the most terrible trials of the present. One of these prophets forward Hosea uttered an ideal of the future, to which the noblest minds have clung, and to which they still hold fast. Isaiah E. 2-4. That grand picture of everlasting peace would be founded on the teachings of Israel which will transform the deadly instruments of war into implements of life-giving labor, excels all works of art that will ever charm the eyes and hearts of mankind. The Israelitish prophets have predicted that this high morality of the nations of the earth will be the outcome of the law which will go forth to them from Zion. The hostile attitude which the two prophets of the kingdom of Israel assumed towards the house of Jehu was not without effect. Just as Elisha and his disciples raised up an enemy against the Amish, so were the attempts against the last of the Jerites probably the outcome of Amos's and Hosea's fiery opposition. Jeroboam II died in peace, at an advanced age and after a long and happy reign, but no sooner had his son Zechariah ascended the throne 769, than a conspiracy was formed against him. The ringleader was Shallum, son of Jabesh, who killed the fourth descendant of Jehu in Italy. Zechariah reigned 244 only a few months. His murderer, following the example set by Jehu in dealing with the house of Ahab, destroyed the house of Jeroboam II, sparing neither women nor children. Shallum then went to Samaria in order to take possession of the throne and kingdom, but he maintained his position only 1 month. A conspiracy was also instituted against him by Menahem, the son of Gadi, a former inhabitant of the capital Tirzah. He proceeded towards Samaria, and was admitted into the capital without difficulty. He killed Shallum 768, but no doubt met with greater opposition than he accepted. Although the capital opened its gates to him, other towns did not immediately submit. The town of Tifsa Taphuch shut its doors against him. Menahem, however, was more daring than his predecessor, and united with his courage the utmost hardness of heart. He laid siege to the rebellious city, and, having compelled it to surrender, he executed the entire population, men, women, and children, not even sparing pregnant women. After this massacre he proceeded to Samaria, where he seized upon the throne of the Jerites. A chief who displayed cruelty such as this could hardly expect to win all hearts. Menahem appears to have abolished the worship of Baal. The worship of the bull, however, was still continued. During his reign the fate of the 10 tribes was influenced by a powerful kingdom which was destined to put an end to the house of Israel. If the better elements of the house might have felt inclined to follow the intimations of the prophet, and turn to the house of Judah for remedy, they met here with conditions equally repulsive. Internal dissensions broke out under Uzziah, which, it appears, were purposely ignored. Uzziah's aim was wholly and solely directed to military affairs, the acquisition of bows, shields, and spears. Spiritual interests were far from his mind, or perhaps were even distasteful to 45 to him. To the Aaronites he undoubtedly gave frequent office, the former harmony between royalty and priesthood having received a severe shock in the latter days of his grandfather Joash. Any endeavor on the part of the king to extend his sway over the temple would have met with the opposition of the anointed high priests, whose authority rested on claims equal to those of the descendants of David. It is certain that in the latter years of Uzziah's government conflicts arose between him and the high priest Azariah, similar to those between King Joash and Zechariah. In order to deprive the high priest of his prestige, Uzziah took a bold step. He entered the sanctuary and began to light the incense burner on the golden altar, an act which was the especial privilege and duty of the high priest. The indignation of the Aaronites ran high. The high priest, Azariah, who together with 80 priests hastened after the king into the sanctuary, angrily reproved him, saying, "It is not for thee, O Uzziah, to bring incense, but only for the anointed priest of Aaron's family. Leave the sanctuary, thou art guilty of desecration, and it will not be for thy honor from the Lord." What followed is wrapped in obscurity. Uzziah in the latter years of his reign was attacked by leprosy, and had to be kept in a special house for the rest of his days. The nation considered this illness as a divine punishment for his daring to perform the rites of the priesthood. In this contest between the sacerdotal and royal houses, the former was triumphant, for it possessed the law as its weapon, and this was of greater avail than the sword. But another spiritual power was soon to enter the contest against the priesthood. 246. Chapter XII. The downfall of the kingdom of the 10 tribes. The house of David, and the intervention of the Assyrians. King Menahem, the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Pekah, Jotham's reign. Isaiah of Jerusalem, his style and influence. His first public address. Later speeches. Their immediate and permanent effect. His disciples. Their characteristics. Zechariah, his prophecies. 758-740 BCE. While Uzziah was compelled by his disease to pass his last 2 years in solitude, his youthful son Jotham managed the affairs of the kingdom. In the kingdom of the 10 tribes, Menahem, the cruel usurper 768-758, was probably ruling with an iron hand. Both kingdoms continued in the same grooves, unconscious of the fact that in the distant horizon storm-laden clouds were gathering which would discharge themselves on them with fearful effect. From the north, from the districts of the Euphrates and Tigris, heavy trials were approaching for the people of both kingdoms. No sooner had the Assyrians extended their territory in the north, east and west, than they turned their attention to the south. They intended, in the first place, to gain possession of the sea-coast of the Phoenicians, and thus obtain control over the wealth of that commercial nation. The next point in view was Egypt, the wealth and renown of which attracted their ambition. For the first time an Assyrian army appeared on Israelitish ground, when King Pul invaded Samaria. King Menahem did not dare summon his forces against the mighty Assyrian hosts. The internal confusion must have crippled his powers to such an extent that he could not think of resistance. 247 The curse of the regicide rested heavily on his head, but it pressed with equal, if not greater, severity on his nation. Menahem was hated by his people, for the cruel means by which he had obtained possession of the throne were ever fresh in their memories, and the friends of the murdered king nursed this hostile feeling. When Pul arrived on Israelitish ground, it appears that the enemies of Menahem suggested to the invader the advisability of dethroning the king. Menahem, meanwhile, betook himself to the Assyrian conqueror, and promised him a large sum of money on condition that his government was left secure. Pul accepted the money and retired from the country, carrying his booty and prisoners with him. Menahem did not draw the money from his own treasury, but forced wealthy individuals to provide it. Each one had to pay what was at that time a heavy sum, viz., 50 shekels. Thus came the beginning of the end, and the fate which Amos had clearly predicted half a century before, appeared to be in process of realization. He had said that a distant nation would carry off the Israelites to a foreign land beyond Damascus. The Israelites were in fact carried off to the region of the Tigris, or to some other division of the large Assyrian kingdom. The power of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, however, remained to all appearance unbroken. It still numbered 60,000 wealthy men, who could pay large sums of tribute money. Menahem still had his cavalry, his war materials, and the fortresses on which he thought he could place dependence. But, unknown to him, old age as one of the prophets had rightly designated the national decadence had now crept over the people. Menahem probably introduced the Assyrian mode of worship. One characteristic feature of this consisted in the adoration of Marlita, the goddess of love, and the duties of her creed included the renunciation of virtue and the adoption of an immoral life. This innovation, 248 added to the already existing internal dissensions, gradually sapped the foundations of the state. When the cruel Menahem died, and his son Pekahiah succeeded 757, the latter was able to retain the throne for scarcely 2 years. His own charioteer, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, headed a conspiracy against him, killed him in his house in Samaria 756, and placed himself on the vacant throne. The mode of this regicide, the seventh which had occurred since the commencement of the kingdom of the 10 tribes, is wrapped in darkness. It seems, however, that Pekah had to remove 2 other competitors before he could himself ascend the throne of Samaria. The son of Remaliah, the last king but one in Israel 755-736, was an inconsiderate and ruthless man, who oppressed the country to an even greater extent than his predecessors. He was characterized as a faithless shepherd, who deserted his flock, who sought not the missing ones, who healed not the wounded, who tended not the sick, and who even devoured the flesh of the healthy. In order to protect himself against the attacks of the Assyrians, he joined an alliance which the neighboring princes had formed in order to resist the encroachments of the Assyrians. The plan probably originated in Damascus, which now once more owned a king, named Rezin, and which would be the first to suffer from the Assyrian conqueror. Judah was also drawn in. Uzziah, the king, having died in the leper's house, his son Jotham, who had ruled for many years as viceroy, assumed the title of king 754-740. Jotham had no very striking qualities. He was neither ambitious nor statesmanlike, but he kept in the grooves in which his father had moved. So the peace seems to have remained undisturbed. There is at least no account of any conflict between him and the high priest. The material condition of the country also remained the same as under Uzziah. There were the squadrons of cavalry, the war chariots, the ships 249 of Tarshish which navigated the Red Sea, and well fenced Lindor. Jotham also strengthened the fortifications of Jerusalem. He maintained friendly relations with the kingdom of the 10 tribes, or rather with their king, Pekah, and there seems to have been a very intimate connection between the two sovereigns. This friendship, however, as well as the rise of an ambitious nobility in Judah, exerted an injurious influence on the morals of the people, the evil being especially strong in the capital. Through circumstances which cannot now be traced, some of the noble families had attained a height of power that exalted them almost to equality with the king. The princes of Judah led the councils, decided the most important affairs of state, usurped the powers of justice, and so thoroughly obscured the dignity of the house of David, that but a mere shadow of its authority remained. There existed a junior branch of the royal family, the house of Nathan, from which the superintendent of the palace seems always to have been chosen. This high official ruled court and attendants alike, and gradually attained to such power and influence, that he was considered the actual regent. He was known by the title of manager of the court Sultan. Other evils arose out of these abuses. The princes of Judah sought to enrich themselves by all possible means, and to extend their territories by obtaining possession of the pasture lands, vineyards, and meadows of the country people. Things seem to have come to such a pass that the nobles and elders employed slaves, or the poor whom they had reduced to slavery, to cultivate their vast estates.
I
did
think
not
that's
hesitate to
it.
make Source
I
official
think
even though
that's
Source
it
were
for the
unable to pay
night.
their
I
debts
think.
and
Well,
forced
let
them
me
to tread
check
the
my
wheel.
complaint.
To this brutal injustice,
Clear my
they soon added
complaint.
vices of debauchery.
Combat.
They arose early in the morning and had
point.
recourse to the wine cup, and till late at night they inflamed their 250 blood with wine. At such
But I went
entertainment
to
they had the noisy
Division
music of
1,
flutes,
so
trumpets,
well,
harps, and lutes.
So it is.
This was an innocent amusement compared with the excesses resulting therefrom. But the severe morality enjoined by the Sinaitic law was hostile to dissipation. As long as this law held sway, the love of licentious pleasures could not be fully gratified. But this restriction disappeared when Judah entered into connection with the kingdom of the 10 tribes. Here, and especially in the capital Samaria, the greatest excesses were, so to say, a sacred character, forming, as they did, a constituent part of all worship. Here there were temple priestesses in numbers. Sacrifices were offered on the summits of the mountains and hills, while spice held its orgies in the shade of the oaks and terebinths. So great had been its progress, that Israelitish daughters unblushingly followed the example of their fathers.
So,
Wine and depravity had so
thanks
vicious
for
minds of the
tuning
great
in.
that they consulted blocks of wood and sticks as
See you
oracles
next
concerning the
time.
future.
Hopefully I'll
From these
get up
nobles of the
and
kingdom of
have
the
it
10
together
tribes, the
tomorrow.
drunkards of Ephraim, ye princes of Judah learned how to follow their evil desires without restraint.
Made it through 50% of volume 1. If I do this, I would finish this set of books in 12 days. So it's worth it. I'm going to try to do that. So thanks.